The fluorescent lights of the ICU hummed their familiar lullaby as I made my way down the corridor at 2 in the morning, my sneakers squeaking softly against the linoleum floor that gleamed under the dimmed overhead lights. Rain tapped against the windows like impatient fingers, creating a rhythm that matched the beeping monitors surrounding bed 7, where my most mysterious patient lay in his 43rd day of silence. "Good evening, John," I whispered, as I approached the strikingly handsome man who had arrived 6 weeks ago with no identification, no visitors, no past beyond the gunshot wound to his shoulder, and the collection of scars that mapped his torso like a violent history book. "Day 43 for you, another double shift for me, and the doctors say talking to coma patients helps so lucky you because you get to hear about my student loans again." I adjusted his IV line with practiced efficiency, my hands moving automatically through the motions I had performed hundreds of times, while my eyes traced the sharp angles of his face, the strong jaw darkened by stubble that I shaved every 3 days, the surprisingly long lashes that rested against cheekbones any model would envy. He was beautiful in that dangerous way that made you think of fallen angels and forbidden things, and I had grown far too attached to this stranger who never responded to my voice, never squeezed my hand when I asked, never showed any sign that my presence mattered at all. The antiseptic smell of the ICU mixed with the lavender lotion I always wore, a small act of rebellion against the sterile environment that had become my entire world since graduating nursing school 18 months ago. My fingers lingered on his wrist as I checked his pulse, strong and steady, and I found myself doing what I always did during these lonely night shifts when the rest of the world slept and I was alone with my silent companion. "So the hospital is threatening to cut ICU staffing again," I told him while smoothing his blanket with unnecessary care, "which means more double shifts for me, but that is fine because it is not like I have anywhere else to be, or anyone waiting at home except Mr. Whiskers, and he is a cat, so his expectations are pretty low." I pulled up the chair that had become mine over these weeks, settling in with the worn paperback I had been reading to him. A mystery novel that seemed fitting, given that he was the biggest mystery in my life. "Chapter 6, I continued, my voice soft in the quiet room where only the ventilator and heart monitor provided accompaniment. And I began to read while the rain intensified outside, and the rest of Sacred Heart Hospital carried on without us in our small bubble of stillness. This nightly ritual had become the most real part of my existence, more genuine than the forced smiles I gave doctors during rounds, or the small talk I made with other nurses in the break room, because here in the darkness with this unconscious man I could be, honestly myself without fear of judgment or disappointment. Little did I know that every word I spoke was being catalogued and remembered, that the man I thought could not hear me had been awake for weeks, that my compassionate habit of treating him like a human being rather than a body in a bed was about to change everything I thought I knew about safety and danger and the terrifying space between them. The clock on the wall read 4:47 in the morning when I finally stumbled back into room 7, my scrubs still damp with the blood of the patient I had lost 20 minutes earlier, despite every desperate attempt to pull him back from the edge. My hands were shaking as I sank into the chair beside John Doe's bed, the weight of failure crushing down on my chest until I could barely breathe. And the tears I had been holding back during the code finally spilled over in hot streams down my cheeks. "I am sorry you are alone," I whispered, my voice cracking as I reached out to touch his face, my fingers trembling against the rough stubble of his jaw. "Everyone deserves someone who cares if they wake up, and I care, even though I know that is stupid, but I do." The ventilator's rhythmic breathing was the only sound in the room, a mechanical heartbeat that seemed to mock the silence of the man before me, and my exhaustion had worn away every professional boundary I had carefully maintained over the past 6 weeks. Something about the darkness of this hour, the heaviest part of night when the soul feels most alone, made me reckless in a way I had never been before, and I leaned forward until my forehead nearly touched his. "You are so beautiful," I breathed, knowing he could not hear, knowing this confession was safe because it existed in a vacuum where consequences did not matter. You have no one asking about you, no family calling for updates, no friends demanding to know when you will wake up, and that breaks my heart because someone like you should not be forgotten. My tears fell onto his face, sliding down his temples like they were his own, and I watched them trail across his skin with a strange fascination born of complete mental and physical depletion. The hand that had been checking his pulse now cupped his cheek, my thumb brushing across the sharp angle of his cheekbone, and I felt something shift inside me, some wall I had built between my professional self and my desperately lonely personal self beginning to crumble. Before I could stop myself, before common sense or training or basic human decency could intervene, I leaned down and pressed my lips gently to his forehead, a kiss so soft it was barely there, more breath than touch. It was not romantic or sexual, but something deeper and more painful, an acknowledgement of shared isolation, a moment of human connection in a place defined by its absence, and I let my lips linger there for 3 heartbeats before pulling back. I wish someone loved you enough to be here, I whispered against his skin, my hand still cradling his face like he was something precious, rather than a John Doe with no past, and possibly no future. I wish you knew that you matter to someone even if that someone is just your night shift nurse, who talks too much and cares too deeply about people she should not. My fingers traced down his jaw one last time before I forced myself to pull away, embarrassment already flooding through me at what I had done, at the boundary I had crossed, at the intimacy I had stolen from someone who could not consent to it. I wiped my tears away and stood up, smoothing my scrubs with shaking hands, trying to reassemble myself into something professional and appropriate, but I could still feel the warmth of his skin against my lips and the terrible loneliness that had driven me to seek comfort from an unconscious man. What I did not know, what I could not have imagined in that moment of vulnerability, was that his eyes had been open for the last 3 weeks, that every word I had ever spoken to him had been heard and catalogued, and that the kiss I thought was my secret shame was about to become the catalyst for everything that would follow. Section 3. The Awakening. The moment I pulled away from his forehead, the moment I thought I had escaped the consequences of my unprofessional intimacy, his eyes snapped open with the precision of a trap springing shut, and I found myself staring into ice-gray irises that were fully alert, fully aware, completely absent of the confusion that should accompany someone emerging from a 6-week coma. His hand shot up with shocking speed and strength, fingers wrapping around my wrist in a grip that was controlled and deliberate. Not the weak grasp of someone who had been unconscious for weeks, but the assured hold of a man who knew exactly what he was doing and had been waiting for precisely this moment. A gasp tore from my throat as terror flooded through my veins like ice water, my nursing training screaming that this was impossible, that coma patients did not wake like this, that something was fundamentally wrong with everything I thought I knew about the man in bed 7. Don't, his voice cut through my rising panic, rough from disuse but carrying an unmistakable tone of command that made it clear this was not a request, but an order. Scream. The single word hung in the air between us while the monitors began their frantic beeping, responding to the spike in his heart rate, to the sudden movement, to the end of his carefully maintained charade. My mouth opened to call for help, to alert the charge nurse, to do what every fiber of my professional training demanded. But his grip tightened just enough to keep me frozen in place, and his eyes held mine with an intensity that made the fluorescent lights above seem suddenly harsh and exposing. "You care," he said, his voice dropping to something softer but no less commanding, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed, the first real movement I had seen from him beyond the steady rise and fall of breathing. "Prove it," he continued, and there was something almost pleading beneath the steel in his tone. "Stay quiet." My pulse thundered in my ears so loudly I was certain he could hear it, could feel it racing beneath his fingers where they circled my wrist, and I became acutely aware of how alone we were in this corner of the ICU at nearly 5 in the morning, with the rest of the staff occupied with their own patients and no one to hear if I did scream. This was not the gradual awakening I had been trained to expect, not the disorientation and confusion that should follow weeks of unconsciousness. And the control he displayed in every micro-expression told me that this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s had been conscious far longer than the last 30 seconds. "How long?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the beeping monitors, and I watched something flicker in those gray eyes, calculation perhaps, or the weighing of how much truth to offer. "3 weeks," he answered, and the admission hit me like a physical blow, because 3 weeks meant he had heard everything, every rambling story about my student loans, every confession of loneliness, every whispered secret I had shared thinking he was safely unconscious. 3 weeks I have been awake, listening to you, learning you, waiting for the right moment, and you just gave it to me, Clara Bennett. The sound of my name in his voice, a name I had mentioned during one of my endless monologues, confirmed the nightmare that was unfolding, that this man had been cataloging every detail of my life while I poured my heart out to what I thought was an empty vessel. "Please," I started, not even sure what I was begging for, and he released my wrist only to press a finger to my lips in a gesture that was both gentle and absolutely commanding. "The alarms will bring someone soon," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "When they arrive, I am still in a coma and you are checking on the equipment malfunction. Do you understand?" I should have refused, should have screamed, should have done anything except nod slowly in agreement, but something in his gaze held me captive, some combination of danger and desperation that made me realize I had stumbled into something far more complex and terrifying than a patient faking unconsciousness. Shach. Section 4. The Dangerous Revelation. His finger remained pressed against my lips for another heartbeat before he lowered it, his ice-gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that made the sterile ICU room suddenly feel like a cage closing in around me, and I became hyper-aware of how isolated this wing was at night, how the nurses' station sat a full corridor away, how no one would hear me if I called out over the ambient noise of ventilators and monitors. "3 weeks I have listened to you," he said, his voice growing stronger with each word, as if he were shedding the pretense of weakness along with the pretense of unconsciousness. "Clara Bennett, 26 years old, nursing student debt that keeps you up at night, apartment in Riverside with the broken heater you complain about every morning, mother with dementia at Oakwood facility that you visit every Tuesday even though she does not remember you half the time." My blood ran cold as he recited the details of my life with perfect accuracy, facts I had shared during those long night shifts when I thought I was simply following best practices by talking to a comatose patient, never imagining that every word was being absorbed and filed away by this stranger who was not a stranger at all anymore. "How?" I started to ask, my voice barely a whisper, but he cut me off with a slight shake of his head. "You talk," he said simply, and there was almost amusement in his tone now. "I listen, and you are remarkably forthcoming when you think no one is paying attention." My professional instincts screamed at me to hit the call button, to alert security, to do something other than stand here letting this man who had been deceiving everyone for weeks continue to control the situation. But something in his eyes stopped me, some flicker of desperation beneath the command that made me recognize he was as trapped as I suddenly felt. "The coma was protection," he continued, and I watched his throat work as he swallowed again, clearly still regaining full function after weeks of minimal movement. "I was shot, that much is true, and I was unconscious for the first few weeks. But when I woke, I realized that being here, being thought incapacitated, was the safest place I could be while I healed." "Protection from who?" I asked, and even as the question left my lips, I knew I was crossing some invisible line, that by engaging with him instead of calling for help, I was becoming complicit in whatever deception he had woven. From people who would finish what they started if they knew I survived, he replied, his gaze never wavering from mine. People who have resources in every hospital in this city, who would have found me and killed me in my actual coma, but who stopped looking once they believed I was a vegetable with no identification and no hope of recovery. The matter-of-fact way he spoke of people trying to kill him should have sent me running. But instead I found myself leaning slightly closer, drawn in by the awful magnetism of someone living in a reality so different from my own. "You used me," I said, and it was not quite an accusation, more an acknowledgement of a truth we both knew. "I survived," he corrected. "And there is a difference." And I could see in his expression that he believed this absolutely, that whatever moral calculus he operated under made his deception not just acceptable, but necessary. The monitors continued their alarmed beeping, and I knew I had perhaps 30 seconds before someone came to check on the noise. 30 seconds to decide if I was going to maintain his cover or expose him. 30 seconds that would determine whether I remained Clara Bennett, responsible night shift nurse, or became something else entirely. "What do you want from me?" I whispered, hating how my voice shook, hating that I was even asking instead of screaming for help. "What you have already been giving me," he said, and his hand moved as if to touch my face before he stopped himself. "Care, discretion, time to heal enough to walk out of here on my own terms." The footsteps in the hallway grew louder, and his eyes flickered toward the door before returning to mine with an urgency that made my decision for me. "Please," he said. And that single word carried more weight than all his commands, more truth than all his revelations. Just a few more days. The footsteps grew closer, and without thinking, I reached over to silence the monitor alarms, my fingers moving with practiced efficiency while my mind screamed at me to stop, to let them come, to end this insanity before it went any further. But his eyes held mine with such desperate intensity that I found myself complicit before I could fully process the choice I was making. He closed his eyes just as the door opened and Dr. Chen poked his head in, his expression mildly concerned as he glanced between me and the now quiet monitors. "Equipment malfunction," I heard myself say. My voice remarkably steady considering my heart was trying to break through my ribcage. "Just a loose lead, all fixed now." Dr. Chen nodded and disappeared, and the moment the door clicked shut, those ice-gray eyes opened again, pinning me in place. "If you alert anyone that I am conscious," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "they will know within hours, and they will come for me. And Clara, they will come for you too, because you have been my sole caretaker for 6 weeks. The implication settled over me like a shroud as I realized what he was saying, that my compassion had made me a target, that every moment of care I had given this stranger had been documented somewhere, recorded by someone. "Security footage," he continued as if reading my thoughts, "shows you spending unusual amounts of time with a John Doe, talking to him, reading to him, touching him in ways that could be interpreted as," he paused, "more than professional." Heat flooded my face as I thought of all the times I had smoothed his hair, held his hand, adjusted his blankets with more care than strictly necessary. And now the kiss, the forbidden intimate gesture that someone somewhere might have captured on camera. "You used me," I said again, but this time anger crept into my voice, pushing past the fear. "I survived," he repeated, but then added, "and I am trying to help you survive too, because whether you believe it or not, you became involved in this the moment you decided to treat John Doe like a human being instead of a body in a bed." Dawn was breaking through the windows now, pale light filtering through the blinds and illuminating the room in shades of gray that matched his eyes, and I could hear the sounds of the hospital waking up, the shift change that would begin in 30 minutes, the ticking clock that made every second of this conversation feel pressurized. "What do you want from me?" I asked, and I hated how defeated I sounded, hated that he had backed me into a corner using nothing but my own compassion as a weapon. "What you have already been giving me," he said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone now. "Care, discretion, time to heal enough that I can walk out of here and disappear, taking the target off both our backs." My hands were shaking as I processed the impossible position I found myself in, trapped between doing what was right and doing what would keep me alive, between my nursing ethics and my survival instinct. "How long?" I whispered. "A few more days," he replied. "Maybe a week. And then I am gone and you can go back to your life as if John Doe never existed." "But if I refuse," I started, and he cut me off with a look that was almost pitying. "If you refuse, you blow my cover, I likely die, and you spend the rest of your considerably shortened life looking over your shoulder wondering when the people who killed me will decide you know too much." The casual way he spoke of death, both his and potentially mine, made my stomach turn, but beneath the horror, I felt a sick understanding that he was not exaggerating, that the world he inhabited operated by rules I could not begin to comprehend. "You are already involved, Clara," he said, using my name with a familiarity that felt both intimate and invasive. "The only question is whether you survive your involvement, and that depends entirely on whether you can keep playing the role of devoted nurse to a comatose patient for just a little while longer." I wanted to scream, to rage at the unfairness of being pulled into a situation I had not chosen, but the sun was rising and my shift was ending, and I had exactly 28 minutes to decide if I was going to become an accomplice to whatever dark game this strikingly handsome man in his late 20s was playing with death itself. Section 6. The First Conspiracy. The distinctive sound of Dr. Werner's expensive loafers clicking against linoleum echoed down the hallway, his early morning rounds always precise and predictable, and I watched as Dante's eyes slid closed with a speed and completeness that was almost supernatural, his entire body going slack in a way that erased every sign of the alertness that had been there moments before. My heart hammered against my ribs as I forced myself to move, to check his vitals with trembling hands, to perform the routine I had done 1,000 times before, while knowing that everything had changed, that the man beneath my fingers was listening to every word, judging my performance, his survival, and possibly mine depending on how well I could lie to a doctor I had worked with for over a year. Dr. Werner pushed through the door with his usual brisk efficiency, his silver hair perfectly combed despite the early hour, his tablet already displaying John Doe's charts as he glanced between the screen and the figure on the bed. "Still no response," he asked, though it was more statement than question, his tone carrying that particular blend of clinical detachment and mild pity that doctors reserved for hopeless cases. "Poor bastard," he continued, moving closer to examine the monitors. "Probably brain dead at this point, just reflexes keeping the body going." I swallowed hard and forced my voice to remain steady, channeling every ounce of professional training I possessed. "Vitals are stable," I reported, pleased that my hands had stopped shaking enough to adjust the IV line with what appeared to be casual competence. "I will continue supportive care, all standard protocols." The words felt like ash in my mouth, each syllable a small betrayal of everything I had been taught about patient advocacy and medical honesty, but I pushed through because the alternative was unthinkable, because somewhere in the last 10 minutes I had made a choice even if I had not fully acknowledged it yet. Dr. Werner nodded absently, already moving toward the door, his attention shifting to the next patient on his rounds, the next problem to solve, completely unaware that the biggest mystery in Sacred Heart Hospital was currently faking unconsciousness 3 feet away from him. The moment the door clicked shut, I released a breath I had not realized I was holding, my knees suddenly weak as the adrenaline that had been holding me upright began to ebb. "Good girl," Dante murmured, his voice so low I almost missed it, his lips barely moving in what might have been a smile, and the words sent a confusing mixture of anger and something dangerously close to pride coursing through me. Outside the room I could hear the sounds of shift change beginning, nurses chatting in the hallway about weekend plans and difficult patients, and whose turn it was to bring donuts. Their voices a reminder of the normal world that existed just beyond this door, a world I was no longer fully part of now that I had crossed the line from victim to participant in whatever conspiracy Dante had drawn me into. The bright morning light streaming through the windows made everything feel starker somehow, the deception more visible, and I became acutely aware of the cameras in the corners of the room, the ones that had supposedly captured my inappropriate intimacy with a comatose patient, the ones that were now recording my first deliberate act of medical fraud. "You need to leave," Dante said, his eyes still closed, but his voice clearer now, stronger. "Your shift ended 10 minutes ago, and staying longer will draw attention. Questions about why you are so devoted to John Doe." I grabbed my bag with shaking hands, suddenly desperate to escape this room that had transformed from sanctuary to prison, but his next words stopped me at the door. "Clara," he said, and I turned to find his eyes open again, that ice-gray gaze holding mine across the small space. "Thank you," and there was something in his expression that was almost vulnerable, almost human beneath the dangerous control. I did not respond, could not find words for the complex tangle of emotions churning inside me, so I simply left, walking past chattering nurses and beeping monitors, and the coffee station where someone had indeed brought donuts, moving through a hospital that looked exactly the same as it had yesterday, but felt completely foreign because I was foreign now, transformed in the span of a single shift from Clara Bennett, the compassionate nurse, into Clara Bennett, the accomplice, and I had no idea how to reconcile those two versions of myself or what would happen when they inevitably collided. MEPCH. Section 7. The Private Conversation. I waited until the hallway cleared, until the morning shift settled into their routines, and the night staff filtered toward the exit. And then I slipped back into room 7 with a fury that overrode every exhausted cell in my body, closing the door behind me with more force than necessary. His eyes opened immediately, unsurprised, as if he had been expecting my return, and I crossed the small space in 3 strides to lean over his bed, close enough that I could smell expensive cologne beneath layers of hospital soap, close enough to see flecks of darker gray in those ice-pale eyes. "Who are you?" I hissed, my voice low and shaking with an anger I had not known I possessed. "Really? Not John Doe, not some anonymous victim. Who the hell are you, and what have you pulled me into?" "Dante Moretti," he replied calmly, as if his name should mean something to me, as if the casual revelation of his identity was not another piece of information that made me more complicit, more entangled in whatever web he had spun. "I am in business and I made some powerful enemies, enemies who do not forgive easily or forget quickly." "What kind of business?" I demanded, and I was aware that I was whisper yelling now, that my professional composure had completely shattered, replaced by something raw and reckless born of too many hours awake and too many impossible choices. "The kind where hospitals are safer than safe houses," he said, and there was dark humor in his tone. "The kind where being shot and left for dead is considered an occupational hazard, where disappearing into the system as a John Doe is actually a brilliant survival strategy." "You are a criminal," I stated flatly, and watched something flicker in his expression. Not quite offense, but close. "I am a businessman who made powerful enemies," he corrected, his voice taking on an edge. "There is a distinction." "Not to me," I shot back, but even as I said it, I knew I was lying to myself, knew that if he were simply a criminal, I would have called security already, that something about him, about this situation, had hooked into me in ways I could not fully understand or admit. The golden morning light streaming through the windows illuminated his face, highlighting the sharp planes of his cheekbones, the strong line of his jaw, the startling beauty that seemed wrong for someone involved in whatever dark world he inhabited. "How long?" I asked, my anger deflating into exhaustion. "How long do I have to keep lying, keep pretending, keep risking everything for a stranger who has done nothing but manipulate me since the moment I started caring for him?" "A few more days," he said. and I could see him calculating, weighing how much truth to offer. Maybe a week at most, I am healing faster than expected, and my people are arranging extraction, but there have been complications. What complications? I pressed, and he shifted slightly in the bed. The first real movement I had seen him make, a sign that he was stronger than he had been letting on even to me. Men have come to this hospital twice already, he said, his gaze holding mine, asking about unidentified patients, checking records, looking for someone matching my description. And so far, the combination of my injuries changing my appearance and the complete lack of identification has kept them from finding me. But it is only a matter of time. I felt ice slide down my spine as I processed what he was saying. That people who wanted him dead had been walking these same hallways where I worked, had perhaps passed me in the cafeteria or elevator, had been hunting while I remained oblivious. "Why should I believe anything you say?" I whispered. But there was less conviction in the question now, less certainty that I could simply walk away from this. "Because you already do," he replied quietly, and his hand moved slightly toward mine before stopping. The gesture aborted, but its intention clear. "Because you kissed my forehead and wished someone cared about me. And that kind of compassion does not come from someone who can ignore a person in need, even when that person is dangerous, even when helping them might destroy you." Section 8. The Deal. Dante watched me for a long moment, those ice-gray eyes studying my face with an intensity that made me feel transparent, as if he could see every desperate thought running through my exhausted mind. And then he spoke with the careful precision of someone making a business proposal. "3 days," he said, his voice low and even. 72 hours of maintaining this facade, of caring for John Doe as you have been, of saying nothing to anyone, and then my people extract me, and I disappear from your life forever." I should have refused immediately, should have walked out right then, but something in his tone made me pause, made me wait for the rest of it, because I could hear there was more. "In return," he continued, watching my reaction carefully, $50,000 transferred to an account of your choosing, untraceable, clean, enough to clear your nursing school debt and pay for your mother's memory care facility for a year, maybe more if you are careful. The number hit me like a physical blow, so large it seemed fictional, an amount that would solve every financial crisis that kept me awake at night, that would let me breathe for the first time in years. And I hated that my first response was not moral outrage but desperate hope. "You are already implicated," he pressed, clearly sensing my wavering. "Security footage shows your unusual attachment to a John Doe, your intimate care that goes beyond professional duty, and if I am discovered now, if those men realize I have been conscious, they will assume you knew, will assume you were helping me, and you will be culpable either way." His logic was brutal and airtight, and I wanted to scream at the unfairness of it, at being trapped by my own compassion, at having a price tag placed on my complicity as if morality were simply another transaction to be negotiated. "Help me and you profit," he said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Refuse, and you are still culpable but poor, still at risk, but with nothing to show for it except the satisfaction of having tried to do the right thing, and we both know how much the right thing costs in your world." "I need to think," I whispered, backing toward the door because I could not breathe properly in this room anymore. Could not think with him watching me like that, with his offer hanging in the air like forbidden fruit. "You have until your next shift," he said, and I could hear finality in his voice. "Tonight, 11 p.m., you walk through that door, and I will know your decision by whether you meet my eyes or call for security. So think carefully, Clara Bennett. Think about your mother who does not recognize you, about the debt that crushes you, about the life you could have if you just looked the other way for 3 more days." I fled then, walking quickly past the nurse's station, where the morning shift was settling in, past colleagues who smiled and wished me a good rest, past the cafeteria where the smell of breakfast made my stomach turn, out into the gray morning light of the parking lot where my ancient Honda sat covered in pollen. The weight of the decision pressed down on my shoulders as I fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly it took 3 tries to unlock the door, and I sat in the driver's seat staring at nothing while my mind raced through impossible calculations. $50,000. Enough to change everything. To give my mother the care she deserved, to stop drowning in debt, to actually live instead of just surviving. And all it would cost was 3 days of lying. 3 days of being complicit in whatever dangerous game Dante Moretti was playing with people who wanted him dead. The morning was cold and gray, matching the moral ambiguity of the choice before me. And as I drove home through streets beginning to fill with rush-hour traffic, I tried to convince myself that I would refuse, that I would walk into that room at 11 p.m. and do the right thing regardless of the consequences. But deep down, I already knew the truth. I was going to say yes. Not because I was brave or criminal or morally flexible, but because I was desperate and drowning. And he had offered me a lifeline, even if that lifeline was wrapped around my throat, even if taking it meant becoming someone I did not recognize, even if it meant crossing a line I could never uncross. Section 9. Clara's World. Outside my studio apartment greeted me with its usual combination of peeling paint and the faint smell of mildew that no amount of air freshener could quite mask, the cramped space feeling even smaller after the events of the night, and I collapsed onto my second-hand couch without bothering to change out of my scrubs. Sleep should have come easily after a double shift, after the exhaustion that made my bones ache. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw ice-gray irises staring back at me, heard that low voice offering me $50,000 for 3 days of silence, felt the weight of a choice I had not yet made, but knew was inevitable. After 2 hours of staring at the water-stained ceiling, I gave up and reached for my laptop, typing Dante Moretti into the search bar with trembling fingers, half hoping to find nothing, half hoping to find something that would make my decision easier. The results were frustratingly vague, carefully scrubbed, just whispers on obscure forums about a Moretti family involved in what people carefully called import-export business, mentions of connections that went high up in city politics, warnings to stay away from anything bearing that name, and the deeper I searched, the more I understood that this was a man who existed in shadows, who had resources to erase himself from public record, who was exactly as dangerous as he had implied. By noon, I could not stand the walls of my apartment anymore, could not stand my own thoughts. So I drove to Oakwood Memory Care Facility, where my mother had lived for the past 2 years. The building's cheerful yellow paint and professional landscaping, a cruel contrast to the reality of what happened inside. The smell hit me the moment I walked through the doors, that particular combination of industrial cleaner and human decline that no amount of potpourri could mask. And I signed in with the receptionist who knew me by name, who gave me a sympathetic smile that made my chest tight. Clara, the facility director, caught me in the hallway, her expression professionally concerned in a way that made my stomach drop. "I am glad you are here. We need to discuss your mother's care plan." We walked to her office in silence, and I sat in the chair across from her desk that I had occupied too many times before, during conversations about declining function and increased need for supervision, and always the rising costs. "The advanced care wing is $8,000 monthly," she said gently, pulling out charts that showed my mother's deterioration in clinical terms. "I know that is difficult, but she is declining faster than we anticipated. The wandering has increased, and she needs more intensive monitoring than the standard wing can provide." "I will find the money," I heard myself say. The words hollow because we both knew I could barely afford the current $5,000 monthly, knew that $8,000 was impossible, knew that I was making promises I could not keep unless I accepted Dante Moretti's offer. The director nodded with the kind of practiced sympathy that healthcare workers develop when confronted with other people's impossible situations. And I escaped to my mother's room, where I found her sitting in the chair by the window, staring out at nothing. "Mom," I said softly, kneeling beside her chair, taking her hand in mine. "It is Clara, your daughter." She turned to look at me with eyes that were the same blue mine had been before I started wearing colored contacts, but there was no recognition in them, no spark of awareness, just the vacant gaze that appeared more often now on her bad days. "I am sorry," she said politely, the way she might address a stranger. "I do not think I know you." The words were familiar, I had heard them before, but they never stopped feeling like a knife to the chest, never stopped reminding me that I was losing her piece by piece, that the woman who had raised me was disappearing into fog and confusion. I stayed anyway, talking to her about nothing, about the weather and the garden outside her window, about memories she did not share anymore. And just when I was about to leave, her hand suddenly gripped mine with surprising strength. "My Clara," she said, and her eyes were clear for just a moment, lucid in the way that happens sometimes, brief windows of the person she used to be. Always trying to save everyone, always taking care of people who cannot take care of themselves. The moment passed as quickly as it came, and she was gone again, retreating into whatever internal world she inhabited. But those words echoed in my mind as I drove back to my apartment in the afternoon light, thinking about Dante Moretti lying in that hospital bed, thinking about the $50,000, thinking about my mother who needed care I could not afford, and my own crushing debt, and the impossible weight of trying to save everyone when I could barely save myself. Section 10. The Return. Committing to the Lie. I stood outside room 7 for a full 5 minutes after clocking in for my 11 p.m. shift, staring at the closed door while nurses moved around me in their usual routines, while monitors beeped their steady rhythms, while the hospital continued its endless cycle of crisis and care, completely unaware that I was about to cross a line that would fundamentally change who I was. My hand hovered over the door handle 3 separate times before I finally pushed it open, stepping into the dimly lit room where Dante lay motionless in the bed, eyes closed, breathing steady, the perfect picture of a comatose patient that I now knew was an elaborately maintained lie. He did not move as I approached, did not give any sign that he was aware of my presence, but I could feel the alertness radiating from him, could sense him waiting for my decision, and my nursing uniform suddenly felt like a costume, like I was playing a role in a performance where the stakes were higher than I could fully comprehend. I moved through my initial assessments mechanically, checking vitals and adjusting monitors while my heart hammered against my ribs, while resignation and defiance warred within me in equal measure, while I tried to reconcile the person I had been yesterday with the person I was choosing to become. 3 days, I whispered finally, my voice barely audible over the ambient noise of medical equipment. Then you disappear. And I never hear the name Dante Moretti again. You vanish from this hospital and from my life as if you never existed. I reached out and touched his hand, letting my fingers rest against his palm in a gesture that looked like compassionate nursing care but was actually my answer, my agreement, my point of no return. His finger twitched against my palm, the movement so subtle that anyone watching the security cameras would miss it, but I felt it like an electric current, an acknowledgement that sealed our conspiracy, that bound us together in this dangerous deception. "And I want the money up front," I added, surprised by the steadiness in my voice, by the defiance that let me make demands of a man who could probably destroy me with a phone call. "Tomorrow, half of it at least, proof that you can actually deliver on your promises before I risk everything for 3 more days." Another twitch of his finger, agreement without words, and I felt a strange thrill run through me at the secret we shared, at the knowledge that beneath his closed eyelids, those ice-gray eyes were probably watching me. that every word I spoke was being catalogued and considered by a mind far sharper than I had given him credit for. The ICU was quiet tonight, unusually so, with only two other patients in beds far down the hall, and the isolation made our conspiracy feel both more intimate and more dangerous, made me acutely aware that I was choosing this, that no one was forcing my hand except my own desperate circumstances, and the terrible calculus that said 3 days of lying was worth a year of breathing room. I continued my nursing routine, administering medications and checking lines, performing the dance of care that had become second nature. But everything felt different now, transformed by intention, by the knowledge that every action was part of a larger deception, that the room had become a stage, and I was an actor playing the role of innocent nurse, while the truth writhed beneath the surface. "You better keep your word," I whispered, as I adjusted his blanket, making sure the cameras caught only appropriate professional contact. "About the money, about disappearing, about all of it. Because if you are lying to me, then I am risking everything for nothing, and I will make sure you regret it." His lips curved ever so slightly, barely perceptible, a ghost of a smile that told me he had heard, that he appreciated my defiance even as he manipulated it, and I felt that thrill again, that dangerous spark of something I did not want to examine too closely. I stepped back from the bed, my decision made, my course set, and as I moved to check on my other patients, I caught my reflection in the darkened window, saw a woman who looked like Clara Bennett but had become someone else entirely, someone capable of conspiracy and deception, someone who had chosen survival over morality and would have to live with that choice long after Dante Moretti disappeared from her life forever. Section 11. The Watchers. At 2 in the morning, I stepped out of room 7 to grab fresh supplies from the medication cart, and froze when I noticed two men in expensive suits sitting in the ICU waiting area, their presence wrong in every way that mattered, because visitors were not allowed at this hour. And these men did not look like anxious family members, waiting for news. They sat with the kind of stillness that spoke of discipline and purpose, their posture too alert for the late hour, their suits too well tailored for a hospital waiting room at 2 a.m. And even from a distance I could see they were watching Dante's room with an intensity that made my blood run cold. Fear spiked through me, sharp and immediate, no longer abstract or theoretical, but visceral and real, and I forced myself to continue my routine with shaking hands, to appear normal even as every instinct screamed at me to run. I grabbed the supplies I needed and walked back toward room 7, passing close enough to the waiting area that I caught fragments of their conversation, their voices low but not quite low enough. "How much longer is Moretti in limbo?" one asked, his accent thick and Eastern European, his fingers drumming against his knee with barely contained impatience. "Boss is getting impatient, wants confirmation one way or another." The other man shifted in his seat, his cologne wafting toward me, expensive and predatory, the kind of scent that probably cost more than my weekly salary. "Could be weeks," he replied, his tone dismissive. "Or never." Bullet scrambled his brain pretty good according to the records we accessed, probably going to pull the plug eventually and save everyone the trouble. My pulse thundered so loudly in my ears I was certain they could hear it. Certain my terror was written across my face in letters large enough to give everything away. But I kept walking with what I hoped looked like professional purpose, slipping back into room 7 and closing the door with hands that trembled so badly I nearly dropped the supplies. Dante's eyes were closed, but I knew he was listening, knew he was as aware of the threat outside as I was, and I moved to his bedside with forced calm, adjusting his blanket in the specific way we had arranged earlier, 3 short pulls followed by one long, our silent signal that danger was present. His finger twitched acknowledgement against the sheets where my hand rested briefly, and I busied myself with checking monitors I had checked 10 minutes ago, with adjusting IV lines that needed no adjustment, with anything that would justify my presence in this room, while those men sat outside like wolves waiting for their prey to show weakness. The fluorescent lights seemed harsher now, casting shadows that felt menacing, and I could still smell that expensive cologne even through the door, could imagine it marking territory like a predator's scent, staking claim to a kill they believed was inevitable. Through the small window in the door, I watched them finally stand, watched them speak to the charge nurse with easy authority, probably asking the same questions they had asked before, probably being told the same answers about John Doe's unchanged condition, and I saw the charge nurse shake her head, saw her gesture toward the charts that showed no improvement, no hope, nothing that would interest men looking for a specific person. They left, finally, their footsteps echoing down the hallway, but the threat did not leave with them. It lingered in the air like that expensive cologne, a reminder that Dante had not been exaggerating, that people were actively hunting him, that the danger I had agreed to participate in for $50,000 was immediate and deadly. I waited a full 5 minutes after they disappeared before I spoke, my voice barely above a whisper. "They called you by name," I said, adjusting his pillow unnecessarily. "They know you are here, they are just not sure which patient you are." His eyes opened a fraction, just enough for me to see the ice-gray calculation happening behind them, just enough for me to understand that he had heard everything, that he was already planning his next move. "Tomorrow," he breathed, so quietly I had to lean close to hear. "Tomorrow my people come, earlier than planned, too dangerous to wait the full 3 days." My heart sank because tomorrow meant the money might not come through, meant I might have committed to this conspiracy for nothing. But more than that, I felt a strange disappointment that our dangerous secret would end so soon, that the thrill of our shared deception would be over before I had fully processed what it meant. The night stretched ahead with new weight, every sound in the hallway making me jump, every shadow seeming to hide threats. And I realized with sinking certainty that I was in far deeper than I had understood, that knowing Dante's real name made me a liability to people who thought nothing of putting bullets in brains, that my compassionate choice to care for John Doe had painted a target on my back that would not disappear even after he did. Handouter Section 12. Midnight Intimacy. The hour hand crept past 3 in the morning, and I found myself back in room 7 after checking on my other patients, my hands still trembling from the encounter with those men, from the reality of what I had gotten myself into, and I sank into the chair beside Dante's bed, with exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness into something soul deep. "I am terrified," I whispered to his unconscious form, knowing he could hear every word, knowing that speaking to him this way had become the only honest thing in my life. Of them, of you, of what I am becoming, because I have never broken rules before, never lied to doctors or falsified records or conspired with criminals, and now I am doing all of it, and I do not even recognize myself anymore. The medical equipment glowed softly in the darkness, creating an intimate cocoon of blue and green light that made confession feel safer somehow, made it possible to speak truths I could barely admit to myself. "My mother needs me," I continued, my voice cracking slightly. "She is disappearing into her own mind, and the only thing I can do for her is make sure she has good care, comfort in her confusion, and I am out of options, completely out of ways to give her what she deserves." I watched his face in the dim light, studying the sharp angles that even in false sleep carried a dangerous beauty, and I saw his hand twitch slightly toward mine before stopping, the movement aborted but its intention clear, as if he wanted to offer comfort but could not risk the gesture. The restraint in that incomplete movement told me more than words could have, showed me that whatever game we were playing had become something more complex than simple transaction, that somewhere in the space between his manipulation and my desperation, something almost genuine was forming. "I will not let them hurt you," he said suddenly, his voice so low and rough I almost missed it, barely more than a breath but carrying absolute conviction. My own breath caught in my throat because he was not supposed to speak, was not supposed to break character even for a moment, and the fact that he had revealed the cost of maintaining his facade. "You are supposed to be unconscious," I whispered, glancing nervously toward the door even though I knew we were alone, even though the cameras would only show me sitting beside my patient in what appeared to be quiet vigil. "Around you that is becoming difficult," he replied, and his eyes opened just a fraction, just enough for me to see the intensity in that ice-gray gaze. "Keeping still while you confess your fears, staying silent while you break apart, pretending I do not hear the pain in your voice when you talk about your mother. It costs me more than you know." The admission hung in the air between us, vulnerable and dangerous, and I felt something shift in my chest, some wall I had built to protect myself from caring about this stranger who had upended my life beginning to crack. "This is insane," I said, but there was no heat in it, only a kind of weary acceptance. "Everything about this situation is completely insane. We barely know each other, and what we do know should make us enemies, or at best clinical professional and patient. But instead, I am sitting here in the middle of the night telling you my secrets and you are, what, pretending to be unconscious while actually listening to everything?" "Learning you," he corrected softly. "Understanding the woman who kisses the foreheads of abandoned patients, who reads to people she thinks cannot hear, who takes on double shifts to pay for a mother who does not remember her name." His words cut too close to truths I had not wanted examined, exposed parts of myself I kept hidden even from my own scrutiny, and I found myself leaning closer to him, drawn by the intimacy of darkness and shared secrets. "Why do you care?" I asked, genuinely confused. "Why does it matter to you who I am, beyond the nurse who can help you escape?" His hand moved again, this time completing the gesture, his fingers finding mine and threading through them with surprising gentleness for someone who lived in a world of violence. "Because you saw me," he said simply. "When I was nothing but John Doe with no past and no future, when I was supposed to be brain-dead and disposable, you saw me as human. And that is—" He paused, searching for words. "Rarer than you imagine in my world." Section 13. The money arrives. The next evening I was checking Dante's vitals when the door opened and a woman glided in carrying an enormous bouquet of white lilies and roses, her presence so striking that I nearly dropped the blood pressure cuff I was holding. She was elegant in a way that seemed effortless, but was probably meticulously calculated. Designer clothes that probably cost more than my car, dark hair swept into a perfect chignon, and eyes the same ice gray as Dante's that assessed me with sharp intelligence before she offered a smile that did not reach those calculating eyes. "Flowers for John Doe," she said, her voice cultured and carrying just a hint of accent, setting the arrangement on the bedside table with practiced grace. "I understand he has been here quite some time with no visitors, so I thought it only right that someone acknowledge his existence. I am just a concerned citizen who heard about his case." My throat went dry as I realized who this must be, one of Dante's people, probably family given the resemblance, and I forced myself to maintain professional composure even as my heart raced. "That is very kind of you," I managed, watching as she pulled a small card from the flowers and handed it to me with deliberate care. "For his primary nurse," she said, her smile sharpening slightly. "I understand you have been particularly dedicated to his care. My brother has excellent taste in guardian angels." The words confirmed what I had already guessed, and I felt ice slide down my spine as I took the card, my fingers trembling slightly as our hands touched briefly. "I am just his nurse," I said, but even to my own ears, the protest sounded weak. "Of course," she replied, and there was amusement in her tone now as she studied me with the kind of attention usually reserved for interesting specimens under microscopes. "A nurse who visits John Doe off shift, who brings him real food instead of hospital meals, who reads to him during her breaks, How dedicated, how unusually compassionate. Heat flooded my face as I realized just how much they had been watching, how thoroughly Dante's people had documented my every interaction with him, and I glanced down at the card in my hands to avoid her penetrating gaze. Inside was a series of numbers, an account and routing information, and a handwritten note in elegant script that simply said, 25,000 deposited, 25 more upon completion. 24 hours left, the woman said, her voice dropping to something more serious as she moved toward the door. Then you never see my family again. You go back to your normal life and forget the name Moretti ever crossed your path. Forget my brother. Forget this entire arrangement. She paused at the threshold, glancing back at Dante's still form and then at me. He chose well, trusting you. Do not make him regret it. Then she was gone, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and the weight of implications I was only beginning to understand. I waited until I was certain she had left the floor before pulling out my phone with shaking hands, logging into my bank account with fingers that could barely type the password. And there it was, $25,000 appearing in my balance like a hallucination. Real money, more than I had ever had at once in my entire life. The knowledge that I was now fully bought, fully complicit, fully entangled in whatever web the Moretti family had woven settled over me like a physical weight. Through the window in the door, I could see other nurses gathering at the station, whispering and glancing toward room 7, clearly having noticed the beautiful visitor and her expensive flowers, and I realized with growing paranoia that my unusual relationship with John Doe was becoming gossip, was drawing exactly the kind of attention Dante had warned me about. I moved back to his bedside, adjusting monitors unnecessarily, and whispered under my breath, "Your sister is terrifying." His lips quirked almost imperceptibly, a ghost of a smile that told me he had heard, that he probably agreed, that I had just met the tip of an iceberg I could not begin to comprehend. The flowers she had brought filled the room with their cloying scent, beautiful and expensive and somehow menacing, a reminder that I was playing in a world where even kindness came with teeth, where every gesture had layers of meaning I was only beginning to decode, and I had 24 hours left to maintain this deception before Dante disappeared from my life, taking with him the strange intimacy we had built in the spaces between his false unconsciousness and my increasingly genuine care. Section 14. The Almost Discovery. Dr. Werner appeared during morning rounds with news that made my stomach drop, announcing that he had ordered a comprehensive brain scan for John Doe because the insurance company was pressuring for updated diagnostics before they would continue coverage, and I watched the color drain from my own reflection in the darkened computer monitor as I realized what this meant. Transport to radiology, 45 minutes in an MRI machine. Technicians monitoring every response, any sign of consciousness or voluntary movement exposing everything we had worked to hide. And I heard myself volunteering to accompany him against protocol, claiming I wanted to observe the procedure for educational purposes, even though my real motivation was pure terror at leaving Dante alone during the most dangerous test of his deception. The transport team arrived an hour later, and I helped them transfer Dante onto the gurney, my hands shaking as I adjusted his IV lines and arranged his blankets, and I leaned close under the pretense of checking his airway. "Can you do this?" I whispered, my lips barely moving, aware that the transport team was watching. "Stay completely still, unconscious responses only, no reaction to any stimuli no matter what they do." His eyes remained closed, but I saw his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. The only sign he could give me that he understood, that he would try, and I felt my heart clench with an emotion I did not want to examine too closely. "I will be right there," I added as they began wheeling him toward the elevator. "I will not let them find out." "Clara," he breathed, so quietly I might have imagined it, my name barely a whisper of air that only I could hear. "Thank you." The radiology department was all harsh fluorescent lights and sterile surfaces, the MRI machine dominating the center of the room like some kind of technological coffin, and I watched as the technicians positioned Dante on the sliding table with professional efficiency, attaching monitoring equipment and explaining procedures to me as if I were a student instead of an accomplice terrified of discovery. The lead technician was thorough and careful, checking Dante's responses with practiced skill, shining lights in his eyes, and noting the lack of pupil reaction, pressing on his nail beds, and documenting the absence of purposeful movement. And each test passed increased both my relief and my amazement at Dante's absolute control over his own body. We are looking for any signs of brain activity beyond basic autonomic function, the technician explained, as they slid Dante into the narrow tube of the MRI machine. Any response to stimuli, any indication of consciousness, but honestly, after 6 weeks with this presentation, I am not expecting much. I positioned myself at the window overlooking the MRI suite, watching the monitors that would display the scans, watching Dante's still form disappear into the machine, and I realized I was holding my breath as the massive magnets began their work with sounds like industrial percussion. 45 minutes stretched ahead of me like an eternity. 45 minutes where Dante had to remain absolutely motionless, despite the claustrophobic tube, despite the deafening noise, despite every natural instinct to move or react. And I found myself silently praying to a God I was not sure I believed in, that he could maintain the facade. The technicians watched their monitors with professional detachment, occasionally adjusting parameters and making notes, completely unaware that the patient they were scanning was fully conscious and fighting every instinct for survival. And I watched the clock on the wall tick forward with agonizing slowness. 30 minutes passed, then 35, and I could see sweat beginning to bead on Dante's forehead, visible on the positioning camera. Could imagine the monumental effort it took to remain so perfectly still, and my own hands were shaking so badly I had to clasp them together to hide the tremor. At minute 42, one of the technicians frowned at his monitor, leaning closer to examine something, and my heart stopped entirely as he called his colleague over to look, as they murmured together in voices too low for me to hear, as they seemed to debate something, while I died 1,000 deaths behind the protective glass. Just some unusual healing patterns in the injury site, the first technician finally said, glancing at me. More organized than we would expect for someone with this level of impairment, but the brain activity scans show no consciousness, no higher function, consistent with persistent vegetative state. The relief that flooded through me was so intense, I had to grip the edge of the console to stay upright. And when they finally extracted Dante from the machine, I saw the exhaustion in the subtle slackness of his features, the cost of that 45-minute performance, written in lines of strain around his closed eyes that only I would notice. Section 15. The Miracle. Back in the ICU, after the scan, Dr. Werner studied Dante's chart with a frown that made anxiety crawl up my spine, his fingers tapping against the tablet in a rhythm that spoke of puzzlement rather than concern. And when he finally looked up at me, his expression was thoughtful in a way that set off every alarm bell in my nervous system. "The scan shows no consciousness as expected," he said slowly, "but there is something unusual about the healing patterns in his brain tissue, more organized repair than we typically see in patients with this level of damage." He moved closer to Dante's bedside, examining him with renewed interest, and I forced myself to breathe normally, even as panic clawed at my throat. "His muscle tone is too good for 6 weeks of coma," Dr. Werner continued, pressing against Dante's bicep with clinical assessment. "Significant atrophy should have occurred by now, but his musculature is remarkably preserved, almost as if," he paused, his eyes finding mine with sharp attention, "as if he has been receiving unauthorized physical therapy." My stomach dropped so fast I felt momentarily dizzy, but years of nursing training came to my rescue, and I met his gaze with what I hoped looked like innocent confusion rather than guilty terror. "Yes," I admitted, opting for calculated honesty because a complete denial would seem suspicious. I have been doing passive range of motion exercises during my shifts, moving his limbs through normal patterns. I read that it helps prevent contractures and atrophy even in comatose patients. I kept my voice steady, professional, channeling every ounce of confidence I could muster. Is that wrong? Was I not supposed to do that without an order? Dr. Werner's expression softened slightly, and he shook his head, some of the suspicion easing from his features. No, just thorough, he said, and there was something almost fatherly in his tone now. More thorough than most nurses would be for a John Doe with no family, no insurance beyond state coverage, no real hope of recovery. He studied me for another moment. You are too good for this place, Bennett. Too compassionate for your own good sometimes, you know that. I managed what I hoped was a self-deprecating smile even as relief flooded through me that he had accepted my explanation, that he had attributed Dante's unusual condition to my excessive dedication rather than consciousness. Someone has to care about him, I said softly, playing into the reputation I had apparently built. Just because he has no one does not mean he deserves to be neglected. Dr. Werner nodded and made a note in the chart before moving on to his next patient, and I waited until he was safely out of earshot before releasing the breath I had been holding. Later in the break room, I endured the good-natured teasing from other nurses who had apparently been gossiping about my attachment to the mysterious John Doe in room 7, their jokes about my special patient and their knowing looks making my face flush with embarrassment that was only partially feigned. Clara has a type, apparently. Sarah from day shift laughed, stirring burnt coffee that filled the small room with its acrid scent. Tall, dark, handsome, and completely unresponsive. Maybe that is the secret to a good relationship. No arguments. Everyone laughed, and I forced myself to join in, even as the fluorescent lights above seemed too bright, too exposing, even as I realized that my cover story of being an overly compassionate nurse was now hospital-wide knowledge, spreading through the gossip network that connected all healthcare workers. At least he does not leave his dirty socks on the floor, I replied, keeping my tone light, and the conversation mercifully moved on to other topics, other patients, other dramas. But I could feel the weight of scrutiny now, could sense that people were watching my interactions with Dante more closely, that my reputation had become inextricably tied to his, and when I returned to room 7 for my evening rounds, I found myself hyper-aware of how my actions might appear on security cameras, how even innocent gestures could be misinterpreted by people looking for something suspicious. "You almost got us caught," I whispered while checking his blood pressure, my back to the door so no one could read my lips. Dr. Werner noticed your muscle tone, the healing patterns. He is starting to ask questions, and I do not know how much longer I can deflect suspicion with the caring nurse routine. Dante's finger twitched against my wrist, where I held it to check his pulse, acknowledgement and perhaps apology, and I felt that now familiar electric current that ran between us whenever we touched, that dangerous connection that was becoming harder to dismiss as purely circumstantial. And I realized with sinking certainty that when he disappeared in less than 24 hours, I would miss this, miss him. Miss the strange intimacy of our conspiracy in ways I could not afford to examine. Section 16. Night Confession. The clock showed 2 in the morning when I settled into the chair beside Dante's bed for what I knew would be our last night together, rain tapping against the windows, in a rhythm that echoed the first night I had kissed his forehead, thinking him safely unconscious, and the circular return to that atmosphere felt weighted with meaning I could not quite articulate. 12 hours until extraction, 12 hours until he disappeared from my life, taking with him the strange intimacy we had built in the spaces between deception and truth, and something about the finality made my carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "I became a nurse because I could not save my father," I said quietly, the confession spilling out before I could stop it, words I had never spoken to anyone because they cut too close to the guilt I carried like a stone in my chest. He had a heart attack when I was 16, collapsed in the kitchen while I was doing homework, and I did CPR wrong, broke his ribs trying to compress hard enough, tried so hard to bring him back, but he died anyway. Tears slid down my face unbidden, and I did not bother to wipe them away, too exhausted from days of stress and fear to maintain any pretense. I thought if I was better, stronger, smarter, if I learned everything there was to know about keeping people alive, then maybe I could save someone. Maybe I could make up for failing him. The medical equipment beeped its steady rhythm like a heartbeat, like the pulse I had tried so desperately to restart in my father's chest. And I watched Dante's face through the blur of my tears, watched for any sign that he was listening, that my confession meant something to someone. His hand moved then, not the subtle twitch we used for signals, but a visible deliberate gesture, sliding across the sheets until it covered mine completely, his fingers warm and strong, and impossibly alive for someone supposed to be comatose. And I heard myself gasp at the contact. "Some people do not want saving," he said, his voice rough from minimal use, but carrying a conviction that made me look up to find his eyes open and fixed on mine with an intensity that stole my breath. "They want witness, someone to see them as they are, to acknowledge their existence without trying to fix them, and you did that for me, Clara." His thumb traced small circles on the back of my hand. "When I was nothing but a body in a bed, when I was supposed to be already gone, you saw me as human, as worthy of care and conversation. And yes, even that kiss you thought was secret, you saw me, and that is rarer than you know." I could not speak, could not process the weight of what he was saying, or the way his words touched something deep and broken inside me, some wounded place that had never healed since I watched my father die, despite my frantic attempts to save him. "You did not fail him," Dante continued, and his other hand came up to cup my face with surprising gentleness, wiping away tears with his thumb. "You were 16 and terrified, and you tried. You fought for him even when it was hopeless, and that matters more than whether you succeeded." The kindness in his voice undid me completely, and I found myself leaning into his touch, into the comfort offered by a man who should terrify me, whose world was violence and danger and death, but who somehow understood the shape of my grief better than anyone who had tried to console me in the years since. "I am going to miss you," I whispered, the admission dangerous and honest and impossible to take back. "Tomorrow you disappear, and I go back to my life and pretend this never happened. Pretend we never happened, and I do not know how to do that." "Then do not pretend," he said simply, his ice-gray eyes holding mine with an intensity that made the rest of the world fade away. "Remember, remember that for a few days you were brave enough to help a stranger, strong enough to face down danger, compassionate enough to see humanity in someone everyone else had given up on." His hand tightened on mine. "Remember that you mattered to me, that in all the years of my life surrounded by people who fear me or want something from me, you were the one who simply cared." The rain intensified outside, and I realized we had crossed some invisible threshold, that whatever this was between us had moved beyond transaction into territory neither of us had intended. And the knowledge terrified me as much as it thrilled me, because in 12 hours he would be gone, and I would be left with the memory of this moment, this confession, this connection that should not exist, but had become the most real thing in my carefully controlled life. Section 17. The kiss returned. In the intimacy of that moment, with rain drumming against the windows and tears still wet on my face, Dante's eyes opened fully, no longer maintaining even the pretense of unconsciousness, and I saw something in those ice-gray depths that made my breath catch, something raw and honest that I had not expected from a man who lived his life in shadows and deceptions. He moved slowly, deliberately, giving me every opportunity to pull away, to retreat into professional distance, to remember all the reasons this was wrong, and his hand lifted to cup my face with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone whose world was violence. I did not retreat, Could not make myself step back even though every rational thought screamed that I should, and I watched as he pulled himself up slightly on the bed, ignoring whatever pain the movement might cause his healing body, his focus entirely on me, with an intensity that made everything else fade away. He drew me closer, his hand sliding from my cheek to the back of my neck. And then his lips found mine in a kiss that was nothing like I would have expected from a dangerous man, nothing like the passion or aggression I might have imagined, but instead, soft and reverent, almost questioning, as if he too was surprised by the tenderness between us. My shock melted into response as weeks of tension released in that single point of contact, as something I had not known I was holding on to finally let go, and I felt my own hand come up to rest against his chest, feeling his heartbeat strong and steady beneath my palm. His other hand found my waist, anchoring me gently, and the kiss deepened slightly, still restrained, still careful, but carrying a weight of emotion that made my chest ache with its intensity. My tears were on both our faces now, salt mixing with the taste of him, and when we finally broke apart, we stayed close, foreheads touching, breathing each other's air in the small space between us. "This is insane," I whispered, my voice shaking. But I made no move to pull away, could not bring myself to break the connection even as my mind catalogued all the reasons this was the worst possible decision. "Yes," he agreed simply, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with maddening slowness. "Tomorrow you are gone," I continued, forcing myself to acknowledge the reality we both knew, forcing myself to say the words that made this moment both more precious and more painful. "Yes," he said again, and I heard regret in that single syllable, heard the acknowledgement that what we had found in this strange circumstance had an expiration date built into its foundation. "I will never see you again," I said, and it was not quite a question, more a statement of the impossible truth that after tomorrow Dante Moretti would disappear from my life as completely as if he had never existed, would become a memory I could never share, a secret I would carry alone. His jaw tightened, and I watched emotions flicker across his face too quickly to name, calculation and regret, and something that might have been longing all warring for dominance. "That is the deal," he finally said, his voice rough. "You go back to your life, I disappear into mine, clean break. No connections, no way for anyone to trace you to me or use you against me." "Then why does this feel like the first real thing in my life?" I asked, the question escaping before I could censor it, exposing a truth I had not wanted to acknowledge even to myself. "Why does this moment with you feel more honest than anything I have experienced in years of carefully doing the right thing, of following the rules, of being good, responsible Clara Bennett, who never breaks protocol or takes risks or lets herself want something she should not have?" "Because maybe we both needed to stop pretending," he said, his hand still cupped against my face, his thumb brushing away fresh tears that I had not realized were falling. "Maybe we both needed someone to see past the roles we play, past the masks we wear, to the people underneath who are just trying to survive in the only ways we know how." The ICU room had transformed around us from the cage it had felt like hours ago into something else entirely, a sanctuary carved out of stolen time, and the medical equipment that had been the soundtrack to our conspiracy now seemed to fade into background noise, time itself suspending to give us this moment that should not exist. "Tomorrow everything changes," he said quietly, his forehead still resting against mine. "Tomorrow I walk out of here and you never see me again. You cash the second half of your payment, and you give your mother the care she needs. You pay down your debt and you breathe easier. And this, us, becomes a memory that you eventually convince yourself was not quite real." But tonight, I found myself saying, finishing the thought he had left hanging, "Tonight we stop pretending. Tonight we acknowledge this thing between us, even knowing it cannot last, even knowing it has to end. His answer was another kiss, deeper this time, less restrained, and I felt myself falling into it, into him, into the impossibility of what we had become to each other in the space of a few days that felt like a lifetime. Section 18. The Trap Springs. The code alarm blared from somewhere down the hall, the harsh sound shattering our intimate moment like glass, and my training took over before my brain could fully process the interruption, pulling me away from Dante and toward the door because somewhere a patient was crashing and I was still a nurse before I was anything else. "I will be right back," I said quickly, already moving. And I saw his eyes flash with something that might have been warning. But the urgency of the code pushed everything else aside, and I ran toward the room where other staff were already gathering around a patient in cardiac arrest. 10 minutes of frantic resuscitation, 10 minutes of compressions and medications, and the organized chaos of a code blue. 10 minutes that felt like both seconds and hours. And when we finally got the patient stabilized, I turned to head back to room 7, with my heart still racing from adrenaline. The moment I pushed through the door, I knew something was catastrophically wrong, the overhead lights blazing at full brightness instead of the dimmed setting I had left. And Dante was sitting upright in bed, surrounded by 3 men in expensive suits who were decidedly not his people, not his sister's elegant sophistication, but something colder, more predatory. Clara's blood turned to ice as she took in the scene, Dante's ice-gray eyes meeting hers with an expression of barely contained fury and something that might have been fear, not for himself but for her, while the lead man turned to face her with a smile that made her skin crawl. "The devoted nurse," he said, his accent thick and Russian, his pale eyes assessing her with the kind of attention a snake gives a mouse. How touching, such dedication to a patient who has no name, no family, no reason to warrant such unusual care. He moved closer to her and she saw Dante tense, saw his hands clench in the sheets, but he was weak from weeks of immobility, outnumbered, and the other 2 men had positioned themselves to block any escape. Viktor Kozlov, the man introduced himself with mock courtesy, extending a hand that Clara refused to take. "And you must be the compassionate Clara Bennett, who has been so very attentive to our friend Dante Moretti here." The use of Dante's real name out loud in the hospital made Clara's stomach drop, made the danger suddenly concrete and undeniable, and she forced herself to meet Victor's gaze even as terror clawed at her throat. "I do not know what you are talking about," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "This is John Doe, an unidentified patient. I am simply doing my job." Victor laughed, a sound devoid of genuine humor, and turned to Dante with exaggerated disbelief. "Did you think we would not notice her unusual attention, Moretti? 6 weeks of surveillance, and we have been watching your devoted nurse spend hours at your bedside, reading to you, talking to you, caring for you in ways that go well beyond professional duty." He pulled out a phone and swiped through images, security footage screenshots that showed Clara holding Dante's hand, adjusting his blankets with unnecessary tenderness, and worst of all, the moment she had kissed his forehead that first night. "We have been waiting for you to tip your hand," Victor continued, pocketing the phone. "Waiting for some sign that you were not quite as comatose as you appeared, and your nurse here gave us everything we needed to know." "Leave her out of this," Dante said, his voice cold and carrying an edge of command despite his vulnerable position. "She knows nothing. She is innocent in whatever grievance you have with me." Victor's smile widened and he moved to stand beside Clara, close enough that she could smell his cologne, expensive and cloying, close enough to make her acutely aware of how isolated they were despite being in a hospital. "But she is so very much in this," he said, his hand coming up to touch Clara's hair in a gesture that made Dante's eyes flash with murderous rage. "She has been protecting you, hiding you, lying to doctors and falsifying records, and the security footage suggests, he paused meaningfully, that her motivations might be more than purely professional. Clara's breath came short and panicked as she realized the full scope of how thoroughly they had been watched, how every moment she thought was private had been documented, how her choice to help Dante had left a trail of evidence that now damned them both. The medical equipment's steady beeping suddenly sounded ominous, a countdown to something terrible, and the room that had been a sanctuary moments ago had transformed into hostile territory, with Victor's men blocking the door and the overhead lights casting harsh shadows that made everything feel stark and exposed. "What do you want?" Dante asked, and Clara heard the calculation beneath his apparent calm, heard him already planning, strategizing, looking for any angle that might get them out of this. Victor's smile became something sharper, more dangerous, as he pulled a gun from his jacket with casual ease, and Clara felt the world tilt sideways, felt everything she thought she understood about safety and hospitals, and the rules that governed her carefully ordered life shatter completely, because this was happening in Sacred Heart Hospital, in the ICU where she worked, in a room 20 feet from the nurse's station, where her colleagues sat unaware that everything was about to change forever. Section 19. The Leverage. Victor moved to perch on the edge of Dante's bed with the casual confidence of someone who held all the power, his gun resting loosely in his hand as if it were merely a prop rather than the deadly threat Clara knew it to be, and he pulled out his phone again with his free hand, swiping through images with deliberate slowness designed to maximize their psychological impact. "We have been watching you for weeks, Clara Bennett," he said, turning the screen so she could see photo after photo documenting her every interaction with Dante, images that told a story of complicity and conspiracy that would destroy her the moment they saw daylight. "Here you are accepting an envelope from Lucia Moretti," he narrated, showing Clara frozen in the moment of taking the card with the account numbers, her face clearly visible, the exchange unmistakably deliberate. "Here you are holding his hand during what the chart says was a time he should have been completely unresponsive. And this one," he lingered on an image that made Clara's face burn with shame. "This one shows you kissing him. Quite tender, really. Very touching for a nurse and her comatose patient." Clara's world was shattering piece by piece as she realized how thoroughly they had documented her every move, how what she had thought were private moments of care had been catalogued as evidence of fraud and conspiracy, how her compassion had been weaponized against her by people who understood that everyone had pressure points, if you looked hard enough. "We also have records of your bank account," Victor continued almost conversationally, as if they were discussing the weather rather than her complete destruction. $25,000 deposited yesterday from an offshore account, very interesting for a nurse who makes $43,000 annually and has been struggling with debt. Hard to explain that as anything other than payment for services rendered. Dante's rage was barely contained. His hands clenched so tightly in the sheets that his knuckles were white, his jaw set in a way that promised violence if he could only find an opening. But Victor's men had positioned themselves strategically, and the gun in Victor's hand remained steady and pointed in Clara's direction. "The choice is simple," Victor said, his pale eyes moving between Clara and Dante with evident enjoyment of their helplessness. "Help us extract certain information from Moretti here, and you walk away. We delete the photos, the bank records disappear. You keep your nursing license and your freedom and go back to your sad little life." Clara's throat was so dry she could barely form words, but she forced herself to ask the question even though she dreaded the answer. "What information?" Victor's smile widened as if he had been waiting for her to ask, as if her question proved she was already considering cooperation rather than principled refusal. "Accounts," he said, ticking items off on his fingers. "Locations of safe houses, names of associates, details of operations, shipment routes, everything that Dante Moretti knows about his family's business, everything that would allow us to dismantle what they have built and absorb what remains." Clara felt sick as she understood what he was really asking, that she use her medical knowledge to help torture information from Dante, that she become an active participant in whatever horrors these men had planned rather than a passive victim of circumstance. "And if I refuse," she whispered, though she already knew the answer, already saw it in Victor's predatory smile. "Then these photos go to the hospital board, and you lose your license. They go to the police, and you face charges for fraud and conspiracy. And most interestingly," Victor leaned forward, "they go to Moretti's enemies, who would be very interested to know that he has formed an attachment to a vulnerable nurse with a mother in an expensive memory care facility. Such useful leverage for future negotiations." The ICU room had become an interrogation chamber, the familiar space transformed into something hostile and threatening, and Clara could smell Victor's cologne overpowering her own lavender lotion, could feel him marking territory, asserting dominance over this small kingdom she had thought was hers. The shadows cast by the harsh overhead lights seemed to press in from all sides, making the room feel smaller, more claustrophobic, and the medical equipment that had been her tools now felt like potential weapons in a game she did not know how to play. "You will not touch her," Dante said, his voice carrying absolute conviction despite his compromised position. "Whatever you want from me, I will cooperate, but she walks away clean, no photos, no threats, complete immunity." Victor considered this with theatrical thoughtfulness, his finger tapping against his gun in a rhythm that set Clara's teeth on edge, and she realized with growing horror that she had become the leverage, the pressure point, the thing that could break Dante's legendary control, and the knowledge made her feel both powerful and utterly helpless. Chapter Section 20. Dante's Sacrifice. Dante pushed himself further upright despite the obvious cost to his weakened body, ignoring the way his hands trembled slightly from weeks of forced immobility. And when he spoke, his voice carried the kind of absolute authority that Clara had only glimpsed before, the commanding presence of a man who was accustomed to being obeyed, even when circumstances suggested he had no power left to wield. "You have my word," he said, his ice-gray eyes locked on Victor with an intensity that made even the armed man shift slightly. "Full cooperation, every account number, every location, every name you want, complete access to everything I know about my family's operations. But she disappears tonight. New city, new identity, the works, and those photos never see daylight." Victor laughed, a sharp bark of sound that held no humor. His gun still pointed casually in Clara's direction, as if to remind them all who held the actual power in this room. "Your word means nothing, Moretti," he said, leaning back against the wall with studied nonchalance. "You have built your entire life on deception and manipulation. Why would I trust any promise you make when you are clearly desperate to protect your little nurse?" Clara watched Dante's jaw tighten, watched him calculating behind those pale eyes, and she saw the exact moment he made a decision that cost him something fundamental, something he had not expected to sacrifice. "Then take my sister as collateral," he said, each word seeming to be torn from somewhere deep inside him. "Lucia for Clara, one life for another. You hold her until you verify every piece of information I give you. And if I lie, if I mislead you in any way, you do what you want with her." The offer hung in the air like something obscene, the willingness of a man to trade his own sister's safety for a woman he had known for mere days, and Clara felt her heart breaking as she understood what this admission revealed about how Dante felt, about how deeply their brief connection had affected him. "You would sacrifice Lucia," Victor said slowly, his interest clearly piqued by this unexpected development. "Your sister who has protected you since you were children, who has been your right hand in building your empire, you would trade her freedom for a nurse you barely know." Without hesitation, Dante replied, and there was no wavering in his voice, no doubt, only absolute certainty. "Clara walks away clean, and I give you everything. That is the deal. Take it or leave it, but decide now, because we both know hospital security will eventually notice 3 armed men in the ICU and your window for extraction is closing." The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, pressing down on Clara's chest until she could barely breathe, and she could hear Dante's medical monitors beginning to alarm as his heart rate climbed, as his blood pressure spiked, as his body betrayed the stress his controlled expression tried to hide. Silent tears slid down Clara's face as she stood frozen between these two dangerous men, watching Dante offer up everything he had built, everyone he loved, his entire empire and his own life essentially, all for her safety, all because somewhere in the twisted circumstances that had thrown them together, he had developed feelings that went far beyond transaction or convenience. Victor studied Dante for a long moment, his pale eyes calculating, weighing the value of the information against the satisfaction of destroying them both. And Clara could practically see the mental ledger as he considered whether Dante's complete cooperation was worth more than revenge. The medical equipment continued its alarmed beeping, a countdown that added urgency to the moment, and Clara realized with sinking certainty that whatever Victor decided in the next few seconds would determine not just her fate, but Dante's and possibly Lucia's, that the sacrifice being offered was real and immediate and would fundamentally change the architecture of whatever remained of Dante's life. "Your sister arrives within the hour," Victor finally said, straightening from the wall. "And you start talking now, every detail, every location, and if I detect even the smallest lie, then your nurse here pays the price before Lucia does. We understand each other." Dante's eyes found Clara's across the small space, and she saw apology there, and regret, and something deeper that made her chest ache with the impossibility of what had grown between them in such a short time. And she wanted to scream that she was not worth this sacrifice, that he should not trade his empire and his sister's safety for her, but the words stuck in her throat because she understood that he had already made his choice and nothing she said would change it now. Section 21. Clara's Choice. Before Victor could respond to Dante's offer, before the deal could be sealed that would destroy everything Dante had built, Clara heard her own voice cutting through the tension with a steadiness that surprised even herself. "Wait," she said, stepping forward despite every survival instinct screaming at her to stay small and quiet and unnoticed. "I have a counter-offer." Both men turned to look at her with varying expressions of surprise, Dante's eyes widening with something that looked like horror as he realized she was inserting herself into negotiations that were supposed to free her, and Victor's pale gaze sharpening with interest as he reassessed the woman he had dismissed as merely a pawn. "I will not run while he suffers," Clara continued, forcing herself to meet Victor's stare, even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "You want information from him, but he is weak from weeks of immobility. Stress will kill him before he tells you anything useful. Shock and pain will make him incoherent or cause him to lie just to make it stop." She moved closer to Dante's bedside, positioning herself between him and Victor in a gesture that was both protective and strategic. "I can give you what you want without killing him," she said, her nursing training giving her words the weight of professional expertise, sedation, the right combination of drugs. "He will talk, and you will get accurate information rather than desperate lies, but I administer the medications and I control the dosage." Dante's expression had shifted from horror to something approaching fury mixed with desperate concern, his voice low and dangerous when he spoke. "Clara, no, do not do this. Take the deal and walk away." She ignored him, keeping her focus on Victor, who was studying her with renewed interest, clearly intrigued by this unexpected development. "You would betray him?" Victor asked slowly, his head tilting slightly as he tried to understand her angle. "Use your medical knowledge to extract his secrets, to help us destroy everything he has built." Clara finally allowed herself to look at Dante, to meet those ice-gray eyes that had come to mean more to her than she had thought possible in such a short time. "I would save him," she said quietly, and she saw him understand what she was really offering, saw the moment he realized she was trying to buy time, to create an opportunity, to play the only card she had in a game where all the other players held weapons. Victor laughed, genuine amusement coloring the sound this time, and he lowered his gun slightly as he considered her proposal. "The devoted nurse has spine after all," he said, almost admiringly. "Very well. You administer the drugs. But my man watches your every move, any attempt at deception, and I shoot Moretti in the head, and then we have a very different conversation about your role in this." Clara nodded, her calm desperati on giving her a clarity she had never experienced before, and she moved to the medication cart with steady hands, despite the terror coursing through her veins. The ICU room had become a three-way power play, a standoff where medical knowledge had suddenly become a weapon as valuable as Victor's gun, and Clara felt herself stepping fully into her own authority for perhaps the first time in her life. She pulled out vials and syringes with practiced efficiency, her mind racing through possibilities and dosages, through what she could give Dante that would appear to loosen his tongue without actually compromising his ability to think clearly, through combinations of medications that might buy them time or create an opening for escape. "What are you giving him?" Victor demanded, moving closer to watch as one of his men positioned himself directly behind Clara, his presence a physical threat that made her shoulders tense. "Midazolam for sedation and anxiolysis," she replied, using clinical terminology like armor. "It causes anterograde amnesia and reduces inhibitions, commonly used for conscious sedation procedures, combined with a small amount of fentanyl for pain control, since his injuries are still healing, and stress will cause him to shut down." She drew up the medications with hands that appeared steady, even though internally she was screaming, even though Dante was staring at her with an expression she could not fully read, even though she was gambling everything on her ability to walk the razor's edge between cooperation and deception. "You should know," she added as she approached Dante's IV line, "that if you kill him before verifying his information, then you get nothing. And if you threaten me while I am trying to work, then my hands might slip and I might give him too much, and then he is merely unconscious and useless to you." Victor's eyes narrowed, but he nodded, acknowledging the logic of her threat, acknowledging that she had carved out a small space of power in this hostage situation by making herself indispensable. Clara's fingers brushed against Dante's arm as she accessed his IV port, and she saw his jaw clench, saw him wanting to protest, wanting to refuse this attempt at salvation, but she met his eyes with a look that begged him to trust her, to understand that she was trying to save them both the only way she knew how. Section 22. The Deception Plan. Victor agreed with a sharp nod, checking his watch with the precision of someone accustomed to operating on tight schedules and narrow windows of opportunity. 30 minutes, he said, his gun now resting against his thigh, but still within easy reach. "You administer your truth serum, we extract the information we need, and then we all walk away, simple and clean." Clara moved to the medication cart with newfound purpose, her hands no longer trembling but steady with the focus that came from having a plan, even if that plan was still forming in real time, and she began pulling vials from the locked cabinet with the confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. She could feel Victor's man breathing down her neck, watching her every movement. But she had spent years working under observation, had performed countless procedures with doctors and families scrutinizing her technique, and she channeled that experience now to appear completely transparent even as her mind raced through pharmacological possibilities. The sedative she was preparing was not what Victor thought, not the combination that would turn Dante into a compliant source of information, but something else entirely, something that would require perfect timing and absolute trust between her and the man whose life she was gambling with. She drew up the medications with deliberate care, holding each vial up to the light as if to verify dosages, performing the theater of medical precision while her brain calculated and recalculated the risk she was about to take. As she approached Dante's bedside with the loaded syringe, she met his eyes and saw the trust there, absolute and unwavering despite not knowing what she planned, and that faith in her steadied something deep inside her that had been wavering. "This will make you talk," she said clearly, her voice carrying to Victor and his men. But you will remember nothing after. The amnestic properties are quite strong. The words were code, a message hidden in plain sight, and she saw Dante's slight nod of understanding, saw the micro-expression that told her he had heard what she was really saying beneath the clinical explanation. Victor moved closer, his pale eyes fixed on the injection site as Clara cleaned Dante's IV port with an alcohol swab. "No tricks, nurse," he warned, his hand moving to rest on his gun in a gesture that was impossible to misinterpret. "I may not have medical training, but I will know if you are attempting deception, and the consequences will be immediate and fatal." Clara met his gaze with a calm she did not entirely feel, channeling every ounce of the persona she had built over days of conspiracy. "I am saving my own skin," she said flatly, letting contempt creep into her voice. "Why would I help him when cooperation gets me freedom and loyalty gets me prison or worse? I am not stupid enough to throw my life away for a criminal I barely know." The words tasted like ash in her mouth, a betrayal of everything that had grown between her and Dante. But she saw understanding flash in his eyes, saw him recognize the performance for what it was, and his infinitesimal nod gave her permission to continue the charade. Victor seemed satisfied by her mercenary logic, settling back slightly as Clara connected the syringe to Dante's IV line with steady hands. The medical procedure had become theater, a carefully choreographed performance where every movement carried multiple meanings, where the language of medicine became code for rebellion, and Clara felt herself fully inhabiting her expertise for perhaps the first time, wielding her knowledge not as a tool for healing, but as a weapon for survival. She pushed the plunger slowly, watching the clear liquid flow into Dante's bloodstream, and she began counting silently in her head, calculating the time until the medications would take effect, until the real plan could begin. Dante's eyes remained on hers, that ice-gray gaze holding steady even as she administered what Victor believed was a chemical interrogation, and the depth of trust in that look, the absolute faith that she knew what she was doing and would not betray him, made her chest ache with the weight of responsibility she had taken on. The performance of compliance masked rebellion, the appearance of cooperation hid desperate gambit, and as the seconds ticked by, Clara prayed that her calculations were correct, that the trust between her and Dante was strong enough to survive what came next, that her medical knowledge would prove to be the weapon that saved them both. Taftash. Section 23. The Reversal. Clara pushed the plunger on the syringe, but the medication flowing into Dante's IV line was not what she had described, not a sedative to loosen his tongue, but something far more dangerous. And simultaneously, she reached with her other hand to adjust the room's environmental controls, increasing the oxygen flow through the wall-mounted system in a way that would seem innocuous to anyone watching. Victor's man behind her was the first to react, his breathing becoming labored, his hand reaching out to steady himself against the medication cart, and Clara watched with terrified satisfaction as confusion crossed his face, as his legs began to buckle beneath him. "What?" Victor started to say, but the word came out slurred and wrong, his gun clattering to the floor, as his fingers suddenly refused to obey his commands, as his body betrayed him in the same way Dante's had pretended to for weeks. The other two men were collapsing now, their eyes wide with panic and awareness, conscious but unable to move, unable to speak, their bodies freezing while their minds remained horrifyingly alert to their helplessness. "Rocuronium bromide," Clara said, her voice shaking now that the deception was complete, her hands trembling as the adrenaline and terror she had been suppressing flooded through her system. "Paralytic agent. You will be conscious but immobile for approximately 20 minutes. Respiratory function depressed, but not eliminated, assuming the dose I calculated is correct." Victor's eyes were full of rage and shock, his mouth working soundlessly as he tried and failed to form words, tried and failed to move any part of his body beyond the most basic autonomic functions, and Clara felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat at the reversal of power. Dante was already moving, rising from the bed with more strength than should have been possible after weeks of immobility, and Clara realized that the saline flush she had administered minutes before Victor arrived had contained the reversal agent, had contained everything Dante needed to counteract the paralytic that was now spreading through the air system in concentrations too low to affect them, but devastating to Victor's men who had been standing closer to the vents. "You brilliant, insane woman," Dante said, his voice filled with fierce admiration as he steadied himself against the bed, his legs shaking slightly but holding his weight. "Clara, what did you do?" "I learned from the best," she replied, her attempt at levity falling flat as delayed shock began to set in, her hands shaking so badly now she had to clasp them together. How to fake unconsciousness, how to appear helpless while actually maintaining control, how to use people's assumptions against them. The ICU room had transformed in seconds from Victor's interrogation chamber into Clara's battlefield, the medical equipment she knew so intimately becoming weapons in her hands, her expertise the tool of their salvation rather than their destruction. Dante moved to Victor, kicking the gun away and checking the man's pupils with clinical efficiency that suggested this was not his first experience with paralyzed enemies. "How long?" he asked Clara, already pulling out his phone to make calls in rapid Italian. 20 minutes before it wears off naturally," she said, her voice thin and high. "Maybe 30 if I calculated the airborne concentration correctly. I have never actually weaponized the ventilation system before, so I was estimating based on room volume and dispersion rates." Dante's phone call continued, but he reached out with his free hand to cup Clara's face, grounding her, bringing her back from the edge of panic she was teetering on. "You saved us," he said quietly between phrases of Italian. "You saved both of us, using the very knowledge that made you vulnerable. Do you understand how extraordinary that is?" Clara looked at the three men frozen on the floor, at Victor's conscious eyes filled with impotent fury, at the medical equipment that had been her ally in this impossible gambit, and she felt the full weight of what she had done crash down on her. "They will come after me," she whispered. "Victor's people, whoever he works for. They will know I did this, and they will come for me." Dante's expression hardened, his hand still gentle against her face, even as his voice took on that commanding edge she had come to recognize. "No one will touch you," he said with absolute conviction. "My sister will be here in minutes with enough men to secure this floor. We extract before hospital security realizes what happened, and you disappear under my family's protection." The victory tasted like terror in Clara's mouth, the successful reversal mixed with the knowledge that she had crossed a line she could never uncross, had used her medical knowledge to harm rather than heal, even if that harm was in service of survival, and the ICU room that had been her domain now felt like a crime scene she desperately needed to escape. Section 24. The Escape. Dante was already moving toward the door with purpose that belied his weakened state, his phone still pressed to his ear as he issued commands in rapid Italian, and Clara stood frozen in the center of the room until he turned back and extended his hand to her with an expression that said he would not leave without her. "We have maybe 10 minutes before hospital security responds to the commotion," he said, his voice urgent but controlled. "Before Victor's people realize something went wrong, before any of a dozen things that could go wrong actually do, we need to move now." Clara's adrenaline was beginning to crash, the shaking in her hands spreading through her entire body as the reality of what she had done settled into her bones like lead. "I cannot just leave," she protested weakly, gesturing vaguely at the hospital around them. "My job, my patients, my mother is in a facility across town. I cannot just disappear." The door opened, and Lucia swept in with 4 men in dark suits, her ice-gray eyes taking in the scene with quick assessment before landing on Clara with an expression that held genuine approval rather than the cold calculation from their first meeting. "Already handled. Lucia said briskly, moving to help Dante steady himself, while her men began efficiently removing any evidence of their presence. Your mother was transferred to our private medical facility 2 hours ago. Best neurological care available. Around-the-clock monitoring. She will receive better treatment than Oakwood could ever provide. Clara felt the room tilt as this information processed, as she understood that the Morettis had been planning extraction contingencies that included her, that they had anticipated she might need protection, and had moved her mother to safety before Clara even knew she was in danger. The hospital will be told you had a family emergency, Lucia continued, already moving toward the door as her men took positions around Dante. Your absence tonight will be explained. Your resignation will be processed, everything clean and untraceable. No more arguments, Dante said, his hand finding Clara's and gripping it with surprising strength. You saved me, now let me save you. We do not have time for debate. One of Lucia's men handed Clara a jacket, and she found herself putting it on automatically, her body moving through motions, while her mind struggled to accept that her entire life was changing in the span of minutes, that the careful existence she had built was dissolving like smoke. They moved through the ICU toward the service corridors, Lucia's team creating a protective formation around Dante and Clara. And Clara caught a glimpse of her colleagues at the nurses' station, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded 20 feet away, chatting about normal things while her world transformed completely. The service hallways were stark and utilitarian, stripped of the comforting medical aesthetics of the patient areas, and their footsteps echoed against concrete walls as they moved deeper into the hospital's infrastructure. Clara realized with distant clarity that she had worked here for over a year and never been in these corridors, never seen this hidden architecture that connected the presentable public face to the practical machinery behind it. They emerged into the loading dock where rain was pouring down in sheets, a callback to that first night when she had kissed Dante's forehead thinking him safely unconscious, and the circular return to stormy weather felt weighted with symbolism she was too exhausted to fully process. 3 black SUVs waited, with engines running, their windows tinted dark against the sodium lights of the loading area, and Lucia directed them to the middle vehicle with efficiency born of practice. As Clara climbed into the back seat, she looked back at Sacred Heart Hospital one last time, at the building where she had spent countless hours caring for patients, where she had built her professional identity, where she had met a man who was supposed to be a simple coma patient, but had instead become the catalyst for her complete transformation. The door closed with a solid thunk that sounded like finality, like the end of something she could never return to even if she wanted to. And as the convoy pulled away from the hospital, Clara felt the last threads connecting her to her old life snap one by one. Dante's arm came around her shoulders, pulling her against him with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with the violence and danger of the past hour, and she let herself lean into his warmth, let herself acknowledge that there was no going back, that she had made her choice when she weaponized that paralytic, and the only direction left was forward into whatever life the Morettis could offer her in exchange for the one she had just lost. Section 25. Safe House Aftermath. The Moretti compound appeared through the rain-streaked windows like something from another world, all stone and glass and security measures that made Sacred Heart systems look quaint by comparison, and Clara barely had time to process the scale of it before they were pulling up to a side entrance. The moment they stopped moving, Dante's carefully maintained control faltered, his body sagging against the seat as the adrenaline that had carried him through the escape finally depleted. And Clara's nurse instincts overrode every other emotion as she saw the gray pallor of his skin, the tremor in his hands that spoke of complete physical exhaustion. "He needs to lie down now," she said to Lucia, with the authority of medical necessity. 6 weeks of forced immobility followed by extreme stress, he has pushed his body beyond what it can handle. We need a bed, and I need medical supplies immediately. Lucia nodded, and within minutes Clara found herself in a bedroom that was larger than her entire apartment, all dark wood and soft lighting, and a bed that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. And two of Lucia's men were carefully helping Dante onto the mattress, while others brought in medical equipment with the efficiency of people who had done this before. Clara washed her hands in the ensuite bathroom that was all marble and gold fixtures, her reflection in the mirror showing a wild-eyed woman she barely recognized. And then she returned to find Dante alone, his eyes closed and his breathing shallow. The role reversal was complete now, Dante genuinely helpless for the first time since that initial awakening, and Clara's hands moved over him with practiced efficiency, but something had shifted. Her touch was still clinical but carried an intimacy that went beyond professional care, an acknowledgement of everything that had passed between them. His skin was hot beneath her fingers as she checked his pulse, fever already building from the stress his body had endured, and she adjusted the IV line that someone had thoughtfully set up, adding fluids and mild sedatives to help his exhausted system rest. "Why did you do it?" Dante asked, his voice rough and fever-bright, his eyes opening to find hers with that penetrating intensity that seemed undiminished despite his physical collapse. "Risk everything, your license, your freedom, your life, for someone you barely know." Clara continued her assessment, her hands gentle as she checked the healing gunshot wound on his shoulder, noting with medical detachment that the rapid movement had stressed the tissue. "Because somewhere between your fake coma and real danger," she said quietly, her fingers tracing the scar with unconscious tenderness, "I forgot this was supposed to be temporary. Forgot that you were supposed to be just a patient, just a transaction, just a means to pay my mother's bills." "Clara," he started, reaching up to catch her wrist, but she shook her head and pulled away, needing to maintain some distance while the emotions of the night threatened to overwhelm her completely. "Do not," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "Not yet. Let me save you first, and then we can talk about what this means, about what we are, about any of it. But right now you need rest, and I need to make sure you survive the night, because I did not weaponize a paralytic and destroy my entire life just to watch you die from exhaustion." He subsided, perhaps hearing something in her voice that told him she was barely holding herself together, that one more emotional revelation would shatter whatever fragile composure she had managed to maintain. The luxurious bedroom was so different from the sterile ICU room that had been their world for days. The medical equipment looked almost out of place against the expensive furniture, but Clara found comfort in the familiar tasks of monitoring and adjusting and caring for someone who needed her. Dawn was breaking through the heavy curtains, pale light filtering into the room and painting everything in shades of gray and gold. And with the safety of the compound around them, Clara felt something inside her finally crack, all the fear and adrenaline and desperate gambles of the night catching up to her at once. Her hands began to shake again as she checked Dante's temperature, noting the elevated reading with concern, and she felt tears starting to fall that she could not seem to stop. "You were willing to trade your sister for me," she whispered, the words spilling out despite her intention to wait. "You were going to give Victor everything, destroy your own empire, and I do not understand why. I do not understand how someone could value me that much when we have known each other for such a short time." Dante's hand found hers, his grip weak but insistent, pulling her down to sit on the edge of the bed beside him. "Because you saw me," he said simply, echoing words he had spoken before, but with new weight behind them. "Because in a lifetime of people who fear me, or want something from me, or pretend loyalty while calculating betrayal, you simply cared, and that kind of genuine compassion is worth more than any empire." The exhaustion and emotion were overwhelming them both. The safety of the compound, allowing them to finally break down after days of maintaining facades. And Clara let herself lean into his touch, let herself acknowledge that whatever had grown between them in that ICU room was real and terrifying and impossible to ignore. And as Dante's eyes finally closed in genuine unconscious sleep, she kept vigil beside him the way she had done so many times before. But everything was different now, transformed by truth and choice, and the acknowledgement that they had both risked everything for each other. Section 26. The Consequence. 3 days passed in the strange liminal space of the Moretti compound. 3 days where Clara tended to Dante as he recovered his strength while simultaneously learning that her entire existence outside these walls had been systematically erased. Lucia delivered the news in the mansion library on the afternoon of the fourth day, her expression carefully neutral as she explained that Victor's organization had been dismantled in a coordinated strike that began the moment Dante was extracted from the hospital, that the power vacuum had been filled by Moretti allies, that the threat was neutralized. And me? Clara asked, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking manicured grounds that still felt surreal in their perfection. What happens to me now that Victor is gone? Can I go back? Lucia's silence was answer enough before she spoke, pulling up news articles on her tablet that showed Sacred Heart Hospital, smoke damage visible on one wing, reports of an electrical fire in the early morning hours, with tragically 2 casualties, including night shift nurse Clara Bennett, whose body had been identified through dental records. Clara felt the room tilt as she read her own obituary, saw her own photograph staring back at her from the screen, processed the elaborate fiction that had been constructed to explain her disappearance. "You cannot go back," Lucia said quietly, almost gently. "Too many people saw you with Dante, too many loose ends that could unravel if Clara Bennett suddenly reappeared. This way you are free, truly free, to start over." Free felt like the wrong word for what Clara was experiencing, as grief washed over her for a life that had been killing her slowly with debt and exhaustion, but had at least been hers, had at least been real and known and familiar. Dante appeared in the doorway as Lucia left, his strength mostly returned now, his movements no longer showing the weakness of those first days, and he took in Clara's expression with understanding that made her chest ache. "I have taken everything from you," he said, crossing the room to stand beside her at the window. "Your career, your identity, your choice to live a normal life. I have destroyed it all, and I cannot undo what has been done." Clara stared out at the afternoon sun illuminating the grounds, at the security personnel moving in practice patterns, at the walls that protected this compound from the outside world and simultaneously trapped her within it. "You gave me something too," she said finally, her voice rough with unshed tears. "A reason to stop just surviving and start actually living. A reason to use my skills for something other than treading water against impossible debt. A reason to feel something other than exhaustion and despair." She turned to face him, needing to see his expression for what she was about to ask. "But I need to know what this is between us. What I am to you beyond the nurse who helped you escape. Is this gratitude or protection or obligation or something else entirely?" Dante's ice-gray eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, his hand coming up to cup her face, with the tenderness she had come to associate with him despite his dangerous reputation. "It started as necessity," he admitted, his thumb tracing her cheekbone. "I needed your help, and you needed money, and that transaction was simple and clear. But somewhere between your confessions in the dark and your willingness to weaponize medical knowledge to save me, it became something I did not anticipate or plan for." "What?" Clara pressed, needing him to say it, needing the clarity of words rather than implications. Dante's jaw tightened as if the admission cost him something, as if vulnerability was harder for him than facing armed enemies or orchestrating criminal enterprises. "Love," he said simply. "Complicated and inconvenient and born from extreme circumstances, but love nonetheless, and I understand if you cannot reciprocate when I have cost you everything. Understand if what you feel is simply trauma bonding or gratitude for protection." Clara felt tears sliding down her face as she processed his words. as she examined her own heart and found the truth waiting there, terrifying and undeniable. The library around them was beautiful in the afternoon light, all leather and wood and the smell of old books, luxury she had never imagined inhabiting, and she stood between worlds, between the Clara who had been and the Clara she was becoming, between grief for what was lost and hope for what might be found. "I do not know how to be this person," she whispered. "Do not know how to be someone who does not exist, who lives in a mansion with armed guards, who loves a man whose world is so different from anything I have known." "Then we learned together," Dante said, his forehead resting against hers. "We figure out who we are now, in this new reality we have both been forced into, and we decide if what we feel is strong enough to build something real from the ashes of everything we lost." Section 27. The Truth. That evening, Dante led Clara to his private study, a room she had not seen before, all dark wood and leather chairs positioned before a fireplace, where flames cast dancing shadows across walls lined with books that looked like they had been read rather than simply collected for display. He poured brandy into 2 crystal glasses with hands that were steadier than hers, offering one that she accepted but did not drink, and they sat in chairs angled toward each other, the fire between them providing light and warmth that somehow made confession feel safer. "I need to tell you everything," Dante said, his ice-gray eyes reflecting firelight as he stared into his untouched glass. "The truth about the coma, about how long I was actually conscious, about the choices I made that brought us here." Clara nodded, settling deeper into the leather chair, preparing herself for whatever revelations were coming, whatever truths might change how she understood the past weeks. "The coma was real initially," he began, his voice taking on a quality she had not heard before, something almost hesitant. "The bullet did significant damage. I was unconscious for approximately 2 weeks while my brain healed enough to regain function, and when I finally woke I was disoriented and in pain and took several hours to fully understand my situation." He paused, sipping the brandy he had poured. "I realized quickly that being in a hospital with no identification was actually the safest place I could be while I healed, that my enemies had already checked hospitals and moved on, that staying unconscious was better protection than any safe house my family could provide." Clara listened without interrupting, watching his face as he spoke, seeing the calculation behind his choices, and understanding the survival instinct that had driven every decision. "But then you started talking to me," Dante continued, and something in his expression softened. "That first night you sat beside my bed and read to me, told me about your student loans and your difficult shift, treated me like a person rather than a body, and I realized I had stumbled into something unexpected." He finally looked up at her, vulnerability clear in his features. "I could have revealed myself after the first week, could have had my people extract me once I was strong enough to walk. But every night you came and talked to me and I was selfish. I wanted more, wanted to hear your stories and your confessions and your kindness that I did not deserve." "You used me," Clara said, and it was not quite an accusation anymore, more an acknowledgement of complicated truth. "Yes," Dante agreed without hesitation. "I used your compassion, your loneliness, your financial desperation. I manipulated the situation to keep you coming back, to keep you invested in my care. And there is no justification for that beyond pure selfishness." He leaned forward, his eyes intense on hers. "And then I fell in love with you. Somewhere between your confessions about your father and your dedication to a patient everyone else had abandoned. And both things are true, the manipulation and the love, the selfishness and the genuine feeling. And I cannot separate them or pretend the foundation was not built on deception." Clara absorbed this, turning it over in her mind, examining how she felt about knowing the full scope of his choices, the deliberate extension of their arrangement when he could have left earlier. The fire crackled and popped, filling the silence between them with ambient sound, and she realized that his honesty now, his willingness to admit the ugly truths, meant more than if he had tried to justify or minimize what he had done. "When did you know?" she asked quietly. "When did using me become loving me?" Dante considered the question, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass in absent patterns. "The night you kissed my forehead," he said finally. "When you whispered that you wished someone cared about me. When your tears fell on my face and I felt your compassion like a physical thing. That was when I understood I had miscalculated badly. That what I thought was a simple manipulation had become something that could destroy me." Clara felt her own tears threatening again as she remembered that night, her moment of weakness that had somehow become the catalyst for everything that followed. "I should hate you for it," she said, but the words lacked conviction. "Should resent the manipulation, the lies, the way you used my kindness against me." "But you do not," Dante said, and it was not quite a question. "No," Clara admitted, meeting his gaze across the firelit space. "I do not, because you are right that both things can be true, that you manipulated me and also genuinely came to care for me, and maybe I needed someone to see me badly enough that I do not regret how it happened." Section 28. Clara's decision. Lucia found Clara in the garden the next evening, the night air cool and clear, stars visible beyond the security lights that marked the perimeter of the compound, like a constellation of protection and imprisonment. She carried 2 glasses of wine and offered one to Clara with a gesture that was almost companionable, settling onto the stone bench beside her with uncharacteristic casualness. "I have an offer for you," Lucia said without preamble, her ice-gray eyes so like her brother's fixed on Clara's profile. "New identity completely separate from the Moretti family. Relocation to any city you choose, financial support to establish yourself, your mother's care guaranteed for life, complete freedom to build whatever existence you want." Clara's breath caught as she processed what was being offered, the escape route she had not known she needed, the acknowledgement that she could leave this gilded compound and the dangerous man inside it. "Why would you offer me that?" Clara asked, turning to meet Lucia's gaze. "Your brother loves me. You said so yourself. Why help me leave?" Lucia took a slow sip of wine, her expression thoughtful in the dim light. "My brother loves you," she agreed. "Rare for him, unprecedented really in the depth and speed of the attachment. But love in our world is a target on your back, is danger and complication, and the constant awareness that enemies will use you to hurt him." She studied Clara with sharp assessment. "I offer you the choice because you should understand fully what staying means, what you are accepting if you choose him over freedom." "Staying is dangerous," Clara said quietly, acknowledging the truth they both knew. "Leaving is lonely," Lucia countered, "and boring, and safe, and everything you have already lived and found insufficient. Choose your hard, Clara, danger with purpose or safety with emptiness, but choose consciously and without illusion." The garden was beautiful in the starlight, carefully maintained roses and stone paths, the fountain in the center creating ambient sound that felt almost meditative, and Clara understood that this space was both an offer and a test, Lucia's way of ensuring she knew the full scope of her options. "I need to think," Clara said, and Lucia nodded, standing with fluid grace. "You have until morning," she said simply. "After that, we need to move forward one way or another. The uncertainty is a security risk we cannot maintain indefinitely." Clara spent hours in the garden after Lucia left, wrestling with versions of herself that seemed incompatible, the rule-following nurse who had spent her life trying to save everyone, and the woman who had weaponized paralytics and watched men collapse without regret. She thought about her father's death and the guilt that had driven her into nursing, about her mother's slow disappearance into dementia, about her own existence that had been a kind of coma, going through motions without fully living. Dante found her near midnight, approaching quietly, and sitting beside her on the bench without speaking, giving her space while making his presence known, and Clara felt the warmth of him beside her, the solid reality that contrasted with the hypothetical life Lucia had offered. "I have spent my life in other people's comas," Clara said finally, her voice carrying across the quiet garden. "My father's death where I failed to save him, my mother's dementia where I cannot reach her, my own safe existence where I was barely conscious, just surviving rather than living." She turned to face him, seeing his features illuminated by starlight and security lights. "You woke me up, made me feel things I thought were not possible anymore, made me take risks I never imagined I was capable of taking." Dante's hand found hers, his fingers threading through hers with now familiar warmth. "I am not asking you to stay," he said quietly. "Will not pressure or manipulate you into choosing me. You have had enough of that. What I want is for you to choose freely, consciously, with full knowledge of what staying means." "I know what it means," Clara replied, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "It means danger and moral complexity and living in a world where normal rules do not apply. It means being with you in whatever capacity that entails. It means choosing passion and purpose over safety and loneliness." His eyes searched hers in the darkness, looking for doubt or hesitation. "And that is what you want, truly." Clara thought of the woman she had been a month ago, exhausted and drowning and going through motions, and compared her to the woman she was now, terrified and exhilarated and fully awake for the first time in years. "Yes," she said simply, "that is what I want." Section 29. The Commitment. Clara found Dante in his bedroom the next morning, the room where she had tended him after their escape, the space that had witnessed his vulnerability and her transition from nurse to something far more complex, and the curtains were open now, letting moonlight fade into dawn, the medical equipment long since removed, leaving only the massive bed and the two of them facing each other across a chasm of possibility. "I am staying," Clara said without preamble, watching his expression shift from careful neutrality to something that looked like relief mixed with joy and terror. "But I have conditions, terms that are non-negotiable if we are going to make this work." "Name them," Dante replied immediately, moving closer but not touching her, giving her space to articulate what she needed. "I do not lose myself in this," Clara said, her voice steady with conviction born from hours of consideration. "I am still a nurse, still someone who helps people. Your world does not swallow mine whole and turn me into something unrecognizable." She met his eyes. "I need purpose beyond being your partner, need to use my skills for something meaningful." "Agreed," Dante said without hesitation. "My family runs a private medical facility for people who cannot go to hospitals, people whose injuries would raise questions, and we need someone with your expertise and compassion to run it, to make it more than just a place where criminals get stitched up." Clara nodded, that possibility feeling right in a way that surprised her, the idea that she could still practice nursing even if the circumstances were unconventional. "What else?" Dante prompted, clearly expecting more conditions. "You never lie to me again," she said firmly. "Fake comas, real ones, manipulations, deceptions of any kind. We have total honesty between us, or we have nothing. I cannot build a life with someone I cannot trust." His hand came up to cup her face, his thumb tracing her cheekbone with the tenderness that had become familiar despite the short time they had known each other. "You have my word," he said, his voice carrying the weight of absolute commitment. "And my heart. And in my world, both of those things are binding, more permanent than any legal contract, more sacred than any vow." The words should have frightened Clara. The permanence implied in his promise, the acknowledgement that choosing him meant choosing a life radically different from anything she had imagined. But instead, she felt a sense of rightness settle into her bones, a certainty that this was where she was meant to be, despite the insanity of how she had arrived here. We are equals in this, she continued, needing to establish the foundation clearly. Partners, not protector and protected, not criminal and accomplice, not boss and employee. I need to know you see me as your equal, despite the differences in our worlds. Dante's other hand found hers, holding her gently but firmly, his ice-gray eyes intense with emotion he no longer tried to hide. You weaponized a paralytic to save us both, he said quietly. You faced down armed men with nothing but medical knowledge and courage. You made choices in seconds that most people could not make with hours of deliberation. How could I see you as anything other than my equal? Relief and terror mixed in Clara's chest as she realized they were really doing this, really choosing each other despite every logical reason to walk away. Despite the danger and complication, and the fact that they had known each other for mere weeks, in the most extreme circumstances possible. This is insane, she whispered, but there was wonder in her voice rather than doubt. Yes, Dante agreed, pulling her closer until they stood chest to chest, until she could feel his heartbeat steady and strong beneath her palm. But it is also the first honest thing either of us has done in longer than we care to admit. Choosing what we want, rather than what we should want. Choosing passion over safety. Choosing each other. He kissed her then, soft and reverent, a seal on the commitment they were making, and Clara felt something settle into place inside her, some piece of herself she had not known was missing clicking into alignment. When they finally broke apart, foreheads resting together, breathing the same air in the intimate space between them, Clara understood that this was a beginning, rather than an ending. That the story that had started with a forbidden kiss to a supposedly comatose patient was transforming into something neither of them had anticipated, but both were willing to fight for. The room where it had all begun now witnessed their conscious choice to continue, to build something real from the foundation of deception and desperation and unexpected love. And as morning light filled the space, Clara felt like she was waking up for the first time in years, truly awake and truly alive, and finally, impossibly, home. Section 30. Epilogue. Full circle. 6 months had passed since Clara Bennett officially died in a hospital fire and been reborn as Clara Moretti. 6 months of learning to navigate a world where medical care happened in shadows and luxury, where her patients were criminals and victims in equal measure, where the rules she had spent her life following were replaced by a more flexible morality that still kept her core purpose intact. The private medical wing of the Moretti compound was her domain now, state-of-the-art equipment behind unmarked doors, a place where people who could not seek conventional help found healing without questions. And Clara had discovered she was uniquely suited to this work, her compassion unchanged, even as her understanding of the world had expanded. A new patient had arrived that afternoon, a young woman in her early 20s with trauma-induced unresponsiveness. The victim of violence, Clara did not need details about to understand, had been profound and devastating. And as the transport team settled her into the bed, Clara felt something familiar stir in her chest. She pulled up the chair that had become hers in this room, just as another chair had been hers in room 7 at Sacred Heart, and she reached out to take the woman's hand with the same gentle care she had once offered to a man she thought was named John Doe. "I know you can hear me," Clara said softly, her voice carrying the conviction of experience. "I know you are in there even if everyone else thinks you are gone, and I want you to know that you are safe now, that no one will hurt you here, that you have someone who cares whether you wake up." She settled more comfortably in the chair, reaching for the book she had brought, a different novel than the one she had read to Dante but chosen with the same instinct that stories mattered. That voice and presence could reach people even in darkness. "Let me tell you a secret," she continued, glancing at the woman's peaceful face. "Sometimes the most important connections start when we think no one is watching, when we are at our most vulnerable and someone chooses to see us anyway, to care anyway, to stay anyway." The afternoon light filtered through windows that looked out on gardens. Clara now walked freely. The expensive but warm space filled with the sounds of life and healing, rather than the sterile silence of abandonment. And roses sat on the bedside table, the daily gift Dante brought to whatever room she was working in, a reminder that she was loved, protected, valued. And sometimes they last forever. Dante's voice came from the doorway, rich with amusement and affection, and Clara smiled without turning, without needing to see him to know he was leaning against the frame, arms crossed, watching her with that protective intensity that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. "How long have you been awake?" she asked, echoing words from another lifetime, from another room where the question had carried different weight, and she heard him move closer, felt his presence behind her chair as his hand came to rest on her shoulder. "The whole time, amore," he replied, his voice dropping to something intimate, meant only for her. "Always. With you." Clara leaned back into his touch, her hand still holding the comatose woman's, and she felt the rightness of this moment, the way her life had come full circle but transformed, the way she was still herself but expanded, still a nurse, but operating in a world she could never have imagined. She had lost everything to gain this, her name, her past, her safe existence. But what she had found in the loss was worth more than she could have articulated: purpose and passion, and a love that had been born in the strangest circumstances, but had proven itself real in the months of building a life together. The woman in the bed might wake or might not, might hear Clara's stories and find her way back, or might remain lost in whatever internal landscape trauma had created. But either way, Clara would be here, offering the same witness and care she had once given to a man pretending to be unconscious, the same compassion that had saved them both. Dante squeezed her shoulder gently before moving to the other side of the bed, pulling up a second chair, settling in beside her as he had done increasingly often in recent weeks, and Clara felt her heart expand with the knowledge that he understood, that he saw her work as sacred even when it happened in the shadows, that he would sit vigil with her for however long it took. "Read to her," he said quietly, his eyes meeting Clara's across the bed. "Tell her the story, the one about the nurse who thought her patient was unconscious, how it really ends." Clara smiled and opened the book, but instead of reading the printed words, she began to tell their story, simplified and softened, but true in its essence. A tale of unexpected connection and dangerous choices in love that survived impossible circumstances. And as she spoke, she saw the woman's fingers twitch slightly, saw the first sign that someone was listening in the darkness, that voice and presence and care were reaching through trauma, the way they once had reached through deception. The medical wing hummed with quiet efficiency around them, other patients in other rooms receiving care from the team Clara had built, the compound beyond these walls protecting them all with security earned through Dante's power and maintained through constant vigilance. And Clara understood that this was her life now, complex and morally ambiguous, and absolutely right for who she had become. She had kissed the forehead of a man she thought was in a coma, and discovered he had been awake the whole time, and that single moment of compassion had led her here, to this room, to this life, to this love that had transformed them both. And as afternoon light faded into evening, Clara continued her story, continued her vigil, continued her work of seeing and caring and bearing witness, knowing that Dante watched over her the way she watched over her patients, knowing that they had both found in each other exactly what they needed, even if they had never known to ask for it. Knowing that sometimes the most profound awakenings happened in the space between consciousness and sleep, between truth and deception, between who we were and who we chose to become.